He married her to use her as a human shield. She let him. Then she made him regret it for the rest of his life. Chicago never sleeps, and neither do its secrets. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on a marriage built on cruelty, a woman dismissed as worthless, and the slow, devastating rise of someone no one saw coming. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button so I can see just how far this tale has traveled. Now settle in. This one runs deep. The wedding cake was white chocolate and raspberry, 3 tiers tall, decorated with sugar roses that looked almost real. Delaney noticed details like that. The texture of things, the distance between what something appeared to be and what it actually was. She noticed it now, standing in the anteroom of St. Augustine's grand ballroom in a dress that cost more than her father had earned in the last 2 years combined, her hands pressed flat against her stomach to keep them from shaking. The dress was Maddox's choice. Everything tonight was Maddox's choice. She hadn't been consulted on the venue, the flowers, the guest list, the music, the menu, or the officiant. She'd been handed a schedule 3 days before the ceremony and told to be ready at 6. The only decision she'd made for herself in the past 4 months was whether to wear her hair up or down. She wore it up. One small thing that belonged only to her. Through the wall, she could hear the low murmur of 300 guests, the scrape of chairs, the clink of crystal. Chicago's finest had turned out in force. Politicians, financiers, property developers who asked no questions about where their funding originated. Crime figures who had scrubbed themselves clean enough to sit in ballrooms and drink champagne. The Viscari name opened every door in this city. It had for 60 years. Tonight, it was being handed to a new generation. And the ceremony wasn't just a wedding. It was a coronation. Delaney knew this. She'd known it since the afternoon 4 months ago when Maddox had appeared at the door of her father's apartment on the south side, let himself in without knocking, and set a manila envelope on the kitchen table without a word of greeting. Her father, Eddie Cross, had gone pale when he saw it. He'd sat down without being asked, the way men sat down when they were about to receive a sentence, and he hadn't looked at his daughter once while Maddox explained the situation with the calm, unhurried tone of a man reading weather reports. Eddie owed the Viscari organization $430,000. Gambling debts compounded by loans he'd taken out to cover the gambling debts, compounded again by interest that had been growing quietly in the dark for 3 years. The number was past the point where payment plans were discussed. At that number, the organization typically collected in other ways. There was, however, an alternative. Maddox needed a wife. Not a partner, not a companion. A wife in the legal and visible sense. Someone who would stand beside him at the ceremony that would formally transfer leadership of the Viscari syndicate from his ailing Uncle Raphael to himself. The criminal commission that governed Chicago's organized interests required it. Tradition demanded the incoming boss present himself as a man of establishment, of permanence, a family man in the oldest meaning of that phrase. A bachelor ascending to power sent the wrong signal. It suggested instability. Impermanence. He'd looked at Delaney once during the explanation, a glance so brief it was almost an insult, and then he'd looked back at her father. The envelope contained the terms. Signed by Friday, and Eddie's debt was erased. Refuse, and Eddie would be found in the Chicago River before the following weekend. Delaney had stood in her kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in her hands and understood, in the particular way that women understand things when the men around them pretend the women aren't in the room, that the decision had already been made. The envelope was a formality. The Friday deadline was theater. She'd said yes that same afternoon. What she hadn't told her father, hadn't told anyone, was that the yes had not required the threat to push it out of her. She would have said it anyway. She had been in love with Maddox Viscari since she was 19 years old, a fact she'd kept buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't there anymore. Almost. She'd met him at a charity gala her father had dragged her to, one of the last years when Eddie's bookmaking operation had been profitable enough to warrant attending such events. Maddox had been 24 to her 19, already moving through the room with the particular quality that powerful men develop early, that awareness of space and the expectation that space would yield to them. He hadn't spoken to her. She'd stood near the bar for most of the evening, too aware of her body in the way that heavy women learn to be in rooms full of thin ones, and she'd watched him across the room and felt something ignite in her chest that she'd had no name for at the time. She'd named it later, in the years that followed, when she'd cataloged every piece of information about him she could find the way other people collected stamps or records. She'd watched him from the edge of Chicago's social world, the kind of edge where you're present but not quite seen, as he'd grown into the man her father's associates spoke about with lowered voices and a particular quality of respect that was very close to fear. She told herself it wasn't love. It was fixation. It was the dangerous romanticism of a lonely woman who read too many novels. She'd argued with herself about it through 2 failed relationships with perfectly decent men who couldn't understand why she kept a distance she couldn't explain, and she'd mostly won the argument. And then Maddox had walked into her kitchen, and it had started all over again. She had agreed to be his wife knowing full well what she was agreeing to. She had not deluded herself. She'd understood that he didn't see her, that she was a solution to an administrative problem, that the morning after the ceremony he would return to his life and she would become a piece of furniture in his mansion, present, unremarkable, and unmoved. She had told herself she could survive that. She told herself that proximity was its own reward, that being near him was better than the alternative, that she would find a way to matter to him eventually through patience and competence and the kind of steady, undemanding loyalty that eventually softens even the hardest men. She had believed this, more or less, until 40 minutes ago. The anteroom attached to the bridal suite had a heat vent low on the wall, close to the floor, the old cast-iron kind that carried sound between rooms like a secret. Delaney had been sitting on the small upholstered bench near it, adjusting the strap of her heel for the 3rd time because her hands needed something to do, when she heard Maddox's voice from the room on the other side of the wall. He was speaking to someone she didn't know by voice, a man with a flat, clipped accent she'd later identify as belonging to a fixer named Garrett Hollis, one of the organization's operational managers. They were speaking without caution, the way men spoke when they were certain no one of consequence was listening. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop. She'd reached for her shoe and then gone very still, the way animals go still when something in the air changes. "Commission wants confirmation of stability," the voice she didn't know was saying. "Marriage is the most visible signal." "I know what it signals," Maddox said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it from the kitchen. Measured, without inflection, the voice of a man for whom most conversations were slightly beneath his attention. The Petrov Group specifically, they want to know the new boss isn't going to get himself killed in the first 6 months. The theory being that a man with a wife is a man with something to protect. Makes him more careful. A pause. The sound of something being set down on a surface. A glass, maybe. "The theory's not wrong," Maddox said. "The girl is—" A brief hesitation. "She's not exactly what anyone expected." "No. I mean, the commission. The commission can keep their opinions about my wife's appearance to themselves." The words were flat, not defensive. Maddox said them the way he might correct a factual error, without heat, without investment. "That's not the point of her." "What is the point of her?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Delaney sat on the bench with her shoe in her hands and her heart somewhere behind her molars, and she waited. "She's visible," Maddox said finally. "She walks into rooms with me. She sits beside me at dinners. She gives the commission what they need to see. If someone with a grudge decides to remove me before I've had time to consolidate, which is a real probability in the first year, a public attack on a married couple is politically messier than a hit on a single man. The wife is a complication they have to calculate." Another pause. "So she's a deterrent," Maddox said. "A visible liability that makes me a harder target. A beat. And when the first year's over?" "That's a conversation for later." Delaney heard footsteps, the sound of a door opening and closing. Maddox's voice again, speaking to someone new, the content irrelevant now. The words just sound. She sat on the bench with her shoe in her hands for a long time. She didn't cry. She'd expected that she would, if something like this ever pierced through the version of events she'd constructed for herself. But the thing she felt wasn't grief. It was more like the feeling you get when you've been holding something very heavy for a long time and you finally put it down. Not relief exactly, but the recognition of how much the weight had cost you. She put her shoe back on. She stood up. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the vanity table and took a careful inventory. She was 27 years old. She was 5'4" and 240 pounds, and she had her mother's cheekbones and her father's stubborn jaw and hair, the color of dark honey that was currently pinned with 11 separate pins into an arrangement the stylist had spent 90 minutes producing. She was wearing a dress that cost $14,000, chosen by a man who had just described her, in terms of precise operational logic, as a human shield. She looked at herself for a long time. Then she picked up her bouquet, opened the anteroom door, and walked toward the sound of the orchestra tuning up. She married him 45 minutes later. The ceremony was beautiful, in the way that expensive things assembled by professionals are always beautiful. The flowers were white and deep burgundy. The candles were real wax, not synthetic. The officiant had a voice designed for cathedrals. The guests were dressed in the particular way of Chicago money, conservative and heavy, jewels real but not ostentatious, dark suits and silk ties. Wealth communicated through quality rather than volume. Maddox stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that had cost more than some cars, and looked at the doors when she appeared, the way grooms were supposed to look. She walked the aisle on her father's arm. Eddie in his rented tuxedo, his eyes red at the edges, his hand over hers on his arm, with the grip of a man who understood exactly what he'd put his daughter into, and couldn't find the architecture in himself to say so. And she kept her eyes on the far wall above Maddox's head and moved at a pace that felt neither hurried nor reluctant. When she reached him, he looked at her. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She'd spent years constructing elaborate fantasies about the look he would give her if he ever truly saw her. The reality was neither warm nor cruel. It was simply the look of a man confirming that a component had been successfully delivered. He took her hand. His hand was large, dry, and cool. He held hers with exactly the right amount of pressure, firm enough to appear genuine, relaxed enough to be comfortable. He had, she realized, practiced this. Or perhaps for him it required no practice. Perhaps all of it was simply management. They said their vows. She said hers clearly and without hesitation, because she had decided on the bench in the anteroom that she would not perform distress and she would not collapse into the moment. And if she was going to do this, then she was going to do it in a way that cost her nothing visible. He said his with the same measured cadence he applied to everything, and she noticed that he didn't look away from her eyes while he said them, which was either a sign of something or of nothing, and she was done trying to parse the difference. He kissed her briefly at the officiant's prompt, dry, businesslike, over in 2 seconds. The room applauded. She smiled. The reception was long. Maddox moved through it with the ease of a man in his natural environment, working the room with the practiced fluency of someone who had attended 1,000 of these events and understood that a room full of powerful people was simply a series of individual calculations. He kept Delaney beside him for the first hour, during the formal photographs and the introductions to commission members and senior organization figures, during which she was presented and acknowledged and then effectively forgotten, the attention moving past her the way water moves past a stone. She shook hands. She said the right words. She smiled at the right moments. She had not been raised in this world, but she had spent 8 years on its periphery, in the company of men like her father who moved through it at the lower levels, and she understood the grammar of it well enough to not embarrass herself. At some point during the second hour, Maddox released her. Not literally. He simply stopped including her in the orbits he moved through, turning slightly away in conversations, not reaching for her hand when the natural moment for it passed. She found herself standing at the edge of things, holding a glass of water she hadn't wanted, and watched the room settle into the configurations that rooms settle into, once formality gives way to appetite. She noticed Celeste Vale at the third hour. She'd known Celeste existed in the abstract way that women in Delaney's position know about women in Celeste's position, as a fact that sits in the peripheral vision and is carefully not examined. Celeste was 30, Italian-American, the kind of beautiful that photographers described as architectural, and she was Maddox's mistress in the particular way that certain men in certain worlds maintained mistresses, publicly known, socially present, not spoken of directly. She was in a green dress at a table near the windows, surrounded by the younger generation of organization figures, and she laughed at something someone said, and the laugh was genuine, and she did not look across the room at the bride even once. Delaney watched her for a moment. Then she looked away. She found a chair at a side table near the kitchen entrance and sat in it for the better part of an hour. And during that hour, something began to happen in the quiet architecture of her interior life. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself, It was more like a slow clarification, the way a camera comes into focus. Not a change in what she was looking at, but a change in how clearly she could see it. She looked at the room. She looked at her husband 30 feet away, who had not looked at her in 45 minutes. She looked at the cake with its 3 tiers and its sugar roses. She looked at her father at a table near the far wall, making conversation with a man she didn't recognize. His rented tuxedo slightly too large in the shoulders. His expression, the particular expression of a man who has made a transaction he knows was wrong and has chosen survival over conscience. She picked up her water glass and finished it. Then she began to pay attention in a different way. She had always been an observer. It was something she'd developed early. The particular skill set of a child who was never the loudest or fastest or most visible in any room, who had learned that you could gather more information by listening than by talking, that the people who were never seen were the ones who saw everything. In the rooms her father had moved through, she'd absorbed years of operational intelligence without ever intending to. Names, relationships, hierarchies, grudges, debts. She'd filed it all without thinking because information was the only currency she had natural access to. Tonight, she extended that attention to the Viscari Mansion's social ecosystem with a precision she hadn't applied before. She watched the way certain men moved around Maddox's Uncle Raphael, a lean, silver-haired man of 63 who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain in his joints. She noticed that 2 men who had been ostentatiously present at the ceremony's start had been absent from the reception floor for the past 30 minutes. She noticed that Garrett Hollis, the man she'd heard speaking to Maddox through the vent, positioned himself in a particular corner near the eastern exit at regular intervals. And each time he did, a different man approached him and spoke briefly and then left. She noticed these things the way she always noticed things, without agenda, without interpretation, as pure data. Filed away. She didn't know yet what she would do with any of it. The night ended at midnight. Maddox's driver took them from the hotel to the Viscari estate on the North Shore, a 12-acre property surrounded by a 12-foot stone wall, with a house that had been built in 1923 and expanded 3 times since, a monument in pale limestone and dark wood that managed to feel simultaneously luxurious and institutional. Maddox sat beside her in the back of the car and checked his phone for most of the drive. He made 2 calls, both brief, both operational. He did not touch her. When they arrived at the estate and a staff member opened the car door, he extended a hand to help her out with the automatic courtesy of a well-trained man, and she took it, and his grip was the same as it had been at the altar, firm, dry, technically appropriate. Inside the house, a housekeeper named Patricia showed Delaney to her room. Her room, not their room. A suite on the east wing, away from the master suite, with a connecting hallway that had a door at either end. Patricia was a compact woman in her 50s who gave nothing away in her expression, and she showed Delaney the closets and the bathroom and the small sitting room adjoining the bedroom with a professional thoroughness that communicated clearly that this arrangement was neither surprising nor new to her. "Is there anything you need tonight, Mrs. Viscari?" Patricia asked. The name landed like a stone into still water. Delaney watched the ripples for a moment. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." Patricia left. Delaney stood in the center of a room that was beautiful and entirely alien, in a dress that had cost $14,000, listening to the house settle around her. She found 11 pins in her hair. She removed them one by one and set them on the vanity table in a row, and then she sat in the chair and looked at the window, where the lake was visible through the bare winter trees, dark and flat, under a moonless sky. A disposable body meant to stand between him and a bullet. She told herself on the bench in the anteroom that she had put the weight down, that she no longer wanted what she'd always wanted, that the 4-second silence before his answer had cauterized something that had been bleeding for 8 years. She sat with that now and tested whether it was true. The honest answer was, not entirely. There was still something in her that wanted to reconstruct the explanation, find the angle from which his words became something other than what they were. She recognized this as the particular, exhausting dishonesty of people who love the wrong thing too long. She'd done it for 8 years, and it had cost her a specific kind of exhaustion that she hadn't named until tonight. But beneath that, underneath the reflex toward reconstruction, there was something new, something that had not been there before she sat down on that bench. A stillness, not peace, not acceptance. Something colder and more functional than either of those. She looked at the window. She had been brought here to be visible, to be a deterrent, to absorb the risk that otherwise would have fallen entirely on him. She had been selected for this role not despite her ordinariness, but because of it. Because a plain, plus-sized, socially unremarkable woman was the kind of wife who generated no rivalries and no attention, who could be positioned like a piece of furniture and ignored until needed. Fine. She'd spent 27 years being ignored in rooms. She knew how to be invisible. She knew how to be present without being seen. She also knew, in the steady, practical way that observers know things, that invisibility was not powerlessness, that the most dangerous position in any ecosystem was the one that everyone dismissed. She didn't make any decisions that night. She was too tired and too honest to make decisions in the dark, with her hair loose and her shoes off, and the weight of the day sitting on her shoulders like a physical thing. But she made one small resolution. She would stop filtering what she saw. She would stop performing the interpretation that made the difficult things softer. She would see this house and this man and this world exactly as they were, without the lens of what she'd wanted them to be. She slept on top of the covers, still in her dress, and in the morning, the first thing she did was take stock. The weeks that followed established the structure of her new life, with the mechanical regularity of a system running itself. She ate breakfast alone in the East Wing's small dining room. She attended the dinners and appearances and charity events that her new position required, which amounted to perhaps 3 social obligations per week. She wore the clothes that had been selected for her by an image consultant named Sylvie, who materialized twice a month with racks of appropriate things, and the particular diplomatic tact of someone paid to dress women whose husbands had opinions about presentation. She and Maddox occupied the same house the way 2 streams occupied the same valley, occasionally visible to each other, flowing in the same direction, never touching. He was, she discovered, extraordinarily disciplined. He woke at 5. He exercised alone in the basement gym. He worked from a home office until 9, when he left for a building in the financial district that served as the legitimate face of Viscari interests. He returned between 6 and 8 in the evening, ate dinner either alone or with operational staff, and retired to his section of the house well before midnight. He spoke to her at the social events they attended together, where he was precisely appropriate, attentive enough to appear convincing, distant enough to communicate that the appearance was performance. In private, they shared perhaps 30 words a day. Good morning. The car's at 7, dinner at 8 if you're available. She was always available. She had nothing else to be available for. She used the time. The estate's library was substantial and unlocked, and she spent her mornings in it with the thoroughness of a woman with nowhere to be and a particular kind of hunger. She read financial texts, corporate law, logistics, supply chain management. She had a business degree from a state university that she'd never used for anything because her father's declining fortunes had pulled her sideways into supporting him. And she'd forgotten until she sat alone in that library how much she'd enjoyed the mechanics of commerce, the way systems connected, the way money moved through structures, the way legitimate and illegitimate economies mirrored each other in their fundamental logic. She also listened. The estate was full of movement, staff, operational figures, the constant low-frequency activity of an organization that ran through the house the way electricity ran through wiring, present in everything and visible in nothing. She learned the patterns. She learned which rooms the conversations happened in and where the dead acoustic zones were, and how to position herself in corridors in ways that made her seem to be heading somewhere while actually being very still. She was not gathering intelligence with any particular intention. She was doing what she had always done, noticing, storing, keeping the raw material without yet knowing what she'd build from it. It was in the 3rd week that she first heard Raphael's name spoken in a context that didn't fit. She'd been in the library, the door slightly open, when 2 men she recognized as mid-level organization figures had passed in the corridor outside. The conversation was brief, something about a shipment, a schedule, a contact in a city she didn't immediately place. The name that snagged her attention was Petrov. She'd heard the name at the wedding in the context of the commission representative Maddox had handled with particular care. But the way the men in the corridor said it was different, not with the deference of legitimate business, but with the particular flatness of operational language, the shorthand of men discussing arrangements that were already made. And immediately after the name Petrov, one of them said Raphael. She sat in the library and turned a page she didn't read and thought about this. Over the following 2 weeks, she heard the name Petrov 4 more times, each time in a context that would have been invisible to someone who hadn't been paying attention, each time in association with arrangements or logistics that were being handled separately from the organization's main operations. And each time she cross-referenced it with what she could observe of Raphael's behavior, the uncle who was supposed to be in retirement, handing power gracefully to his nephew, but who moved through the estate with a restless energy that didn't match the narrative of a man winding down. She thought about Maddox telling his fixer that the first year was a period of real danger, that enemies would calculate whether the new leadership was stable before deciding whether to move against it. She thought about Raphael's hands at the wedding reception, perfectly still on the table in front of him, while everyone around him gestured and animated, the stillness of a man waiting for something. She had no evidence. She had observations and pattern recognition and the particular inarticulate certainty of someone who has been in the presence of concealed intentions long enough to recognize their texture. She wasn't sure what to do with it. She thought about going to Maddox. She constructed that conversation in her head and found it immediately, comprehensively implausible. She could hear his voice through the vent with perfect clarity, the brisk economy of his assessment. And she understood that arriving at his office with a theory built from overheard fragments and the behavior of his uncle's hands would be received as exactly what he'd expect from her, the anxious meddling of a woman with too much time and too little standing. She thought about saying nothing. This was the easier option. She'd been brought here to be visible and quiet, and she could simply continue being both. But the information sat in her chest like something with weight, and she had always been honest with herself, even when honesty was inconvenient. And the honest truth was that whatever she felt about the man she'd married, she did not want him dead. Not for his sake. She told herself that clearly and without sentiment. She didn't want him dead because she was not done here yet. Because this situation was not finished resolving itself. Because she had not yet arrived at the place she was moving toward, and she could not see that place from here. But she knew with the deep certainty of someone who had spent a long time being underestimated that it existed. She chose to tell him. She went to his office on a Tuesday evening in the 6th week of their marriage. He was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, working through documents with the focused efficiency of a man who treated time as a finite and precious resource. He looked up when she knocked. The look was neutral, not unwelcoming, not warm. The look of a man being interrupted by a thing he'd temporarily forgotten existed. "I need to talk to you about Raphael," she said. She stood in the doorway and laid it out. She gave him the specific instances, the conversations, the dates, the contexts. She told him the name Petrov. She told him about Raphael's stillness at the reception, the particular quality of a man in the posture of waiting. She told him she had no evidence, only observed patterns, and that she understood the limitations of what she was offering. She was careful and precise, and she kept her voice level throughout, because she had learned young that women who brought difficult information with any emotion attached to it were dismissed on the basis of the emotion rather than engaged on the basis of the information. Maddox listened. She finished. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the administrative assessment of the altar, not the practiced politeness of social events, but something attentive and slightly recalibrated. As if she'd said something that required him to adjust the setting he'd had her on. Then the moment passed. "You've been listening to conversations that aren't yours," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Through vents and cracked doors." "Yes. And from this you've constructed a theory about my uncle's intentions." She met his eyes. "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. "Raphael built this organization over 40 years. He is the reason there is anything to inherit. His loyalty to this family is not something I need to be concerned about." "I'm not telling you what to be concerned about," Delaney said. "I'm telling you what I heard and what I observed. What you do with it is your decision." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched past comfortable. "Thank you," he said finally, in a tone that was not grateful. It was dismissive in the specific, polished way of powerful men who had learned to make dismissal sound like courtesy. "Is there anything else?" She recognized the tone. She'd heard it her whole life. "No," she said. "That's everything." She went back to the east wing. She sat in her chair by the window. The lake was dark and flat, exactly as it had been on her wedding night, She made no dramatic G solutions. She didn't rage or weep or make any of the gestures she'd once imagined making in situations like this. She simply sat and understood, with cold and growing clarity, exactly what she was dealing with. He had heard her, he had assessed her, he had concluded she was not a credible source, not because of what she'd said, because of what she was. Invisible, unremarkable. The furniture he'd positioned in his house for reasons of operational utility. She had forgotten her function and tried to participate in something above her assigned role, and he had corrected her with the efficient courtesy of a man who had no reason to be cruel, because cruelty required investment. She sat with that. Then she made a decision. Not about him, not about the marriage, not about what she felt or didn't feel, or had stopped feeling, or never stopped feeling. A simpler decision, closer to the ground. She was not going to be invisible anymore. Not in the way she'd been. She was going to be invisible differently. The way a weapon is invisible when it's sheathed. The way a current is invisible beneath still water. She was going to pay attention to everything. She was going to learn this world the way she'd learned everything in her life that had mattered. Slowly, thoroughly, from the outside in, without anyone noticing she was doing it. And she was going to trust her own observations. Not because she was certain she was right about Raphael. She might be wrong. She had no way to know yet. But she had been in rooms her entire life where people like her, women like her, heavy and quiet and presumed harmless, were spoken around rather than spoken to, and she had absorbed more in those rooms than the people speaking had ever imagined. She knew how to read the text beneath the text. She'd been reading it since she was 12 years old. She was done waiting to be proven right. She was going to make herself indispensable. She just hadn't decided yet to whom. The next morning she woke at 4:30, an hour before Maddox's alarm, and sat at the small desk in her sitting room and began to write down everything she'd heard and observed in the past 6 weeks from memory, organized by date and context and the names of everyone she could identify. She wrote in longhand in a notebook she'd found in the library, small and dense. And when she was finished, she read it back to herself and understood that she was looking at something real. Petrov was not a commission contact. Petrov was an Eastern European syndicate, specifically the operation out of Bratislava that had been trying to establish a foothold in Chicago's shipping infrastructure for 3 years. She knew this because she'd read it in a summary document that had been left on the kitchen table 2 weeks ago by a staff member who'd assumed she wouldn't know what she was looking at. She knew what she was looking at. And now she knew that Raphael had been in contact with them for at least 6 weeks, through intermediaries that Maddox's regular operational oversight wouldn't catch, using channels that ran parallel to the organization's standard logistics. She didn't know yet what Raphael was planning. She didn't know the timeline or the mechanism or the specific nature of the arrangement, but she knew the shape of it, an ambush, an execution dressed as a turf dispute, executed by Petrov's people with Raphael's inside information about his nephew's movements and schedule, leaving Raphael to step back into the power vacuum with clean hands and a grieving face and the sympathy of an organization that would never know. She sat with this for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and held it in her hands and thought about what it meant. It meant Maddox Vescari, the man who had married her as a human shield, the man who had described her to a fixer as a deterrent and a liability, the man who had dismissed her information with the polite efficiency of a man taking out the trash. That man was walking, without knowing it, toward an execution that his own uncle had designed for him. She sat with that too. Here was the moment she would return to for a long time afterward, the moment she would examine from every angle in the months and years that followed, looking for the version of it that made her a simple person with a simple motivation. She never found it. What she felt was not love, or not only love, and not duty, and not some pure selfless impulse toward the protection of human life. What she felt was the particular unsentimental reaction of a woman who had been watching a game play out from the sidelines and had just understood that the game was about to change in ways that would eliminate her entirely from the board. She was in this situation. She had chosen it, or had it chosen for her, and either way she was inside it, and her survival, not dramatic, physical survival, but the survival of the version of herself she was slowly and painstakingly constructing in the east wing of the Vescari estate, depended on the situation remaining stable long enough for her to accumulate what she needed to accumulate. If Maddox was killed, Raphael stepped in, and Raphael would have no use for her. The debt would be meaningless to him. She would be expelled from the estate within the week, returned to her father's apartment on the south side with nothing, having spent 6 weeks becoming fluent in a world that would then close its doors to her permanently. That was the practical calculation. But underneath the practical calculation, if she was honest, and she was always honest with herself, even when the honesty was ungainly, underneath it there was something that wasn't calculation at all. She didn't want him dead. She set the notebook on the desk. She walked to the window. The lake was gray in the pre-dawn light, flat and cold and very large. She had 2 choices: warn him again and be dismissed again, or find another way to put herself between the plan and its outcome. She made the decision without fully deciding it, the way she'd said yes in her father's kitchen. Not as a dramatic act of will, but as the quiet acknowledgement of something she'd already known for longer than she'd admitted. She was going to be there when it happened. She just needed to know when. It took her 11 days to find out. She found it not through daring or subterfuge, but through the same skill she'd always had, through being present in rooms without being noticed, through the particular patience of someone who had learned early that the most important information was never protected because the people holding it never imagined it was at risk. She was in the laundry room off the kitchen on a Thursday evening, ostensibly retrieving a cardigan, when she heard Raphael on his phone in the adjoining mudroom. The door was 4 inches open. She stood very still with the cardigan in her hands. 1 sentence, 1 date, 1 location, the shipping docks at the east end of the lakefront. Friday, midnight. She went back to her room and sat very still for a long time and thought about what a woman with no authority, no standing, no credibility, and no allies was supposed to do with information that was going to get her husband killed in 41 hours. She thought about going to him again. She sat with that image, herself at his office door again, the same information delivered with greater urgency, the same polished dismissal. No. She thought about going to someone else in the organization, someone with standing, with operational credibility, who would be listened to. But she knew no one she could trust, had made no alliances, had been invisible in exactly the way she'd been placed here to be invisible. And there was no one. She thought about calling the police and immediately dismissed it, not because she had any particular loyalty to the Viscari operation, but because introducing law enforcement into this would create a disruption so total that the east wing of the estate would be the least of her problems. She sat for a long time and she thought. Then she made the only decision that was left. She would go to the docks. She would be there when it happened. She didn't know exactly what she would do. She didn't have a plan in the way that plans required specificity and preparation and resources she didn't have. She had a location and a time and the raw, unorganized truth that she was not going to sit in the east wing and stare at the lake while the situation resolved itself over her head. She would figure out the rest when she got there. She spent the next 39 hours preparing in the only ways available to her, studying the dock's layout from historical records she found in the estate's library, sleeping as much as she could, eating carefully, and writing in the small notebook everything she knew so that if something went wrong, the information would exist somewhere independent of her. On Friday, she put the notebook in the library behind a copy of a logistics manual no one had touched in years. She dressed in dark clothes from the back of her closet. She took $300 from the household account she'd been given access to for incidentals, and didn't think about the implications. She ordered a car service from a number she found online, not the estate's usual service. She left at 11. She left through the east wing's side entrance, which opened onto the garden path that led to the secondary gate. She had never used this exit before. She wasn't sure anyone knew she knew it existed. The car took her south along the lake. The night was cold. January in Chicago was a particular kind of cold. Not the wet cold of coastal cities, but the cutting cold of a place the wind came through without apology, a cold with intention. She sat in the back of the car and watched the city pass, and felt very clearly and without drama the simple fact that she had no idea if she would be in this car going home in 2 hours, or if she would be something else entirely. She was frightened. She recognized the fear as useful information and set it aside. The driver led her out 3 blocks from the dock entrance. She paid cash, told him not to wait, and stood on the sidewalk while the car disappeared and the city noise settled around her like water. Then she walked toward the lake. The shipping docks at the East Lakefront were a working industrial area, open 24 hours but minimally staffed at midnight, The kind of place where the darkness had texture. The stacked containers, the cranes standing still against the sky, the smell of rust and diesel and cold water. The lights were high and sparse, throwing long shadows between the stacks. She moved along the perimeter, keeping to the shadows with the instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime not drawing attention. She found a position between two containers with a clear line of sight to the central loading area, where the dock's main road widened into an open space the size of a basketball court. She waited. At 11:52, she heard the vehicles. 3 black SUVs came in from the south entrance, their headlights off. They moved slowly, and she could see men in them. 3, 4 to a vehicle. This was Maddox's convoy, the kind he used for meetings that required discretion. She could see the shape of the man in the lead vehicle's passenger seat, and even at this distance, through the dark, she knew the set of those shoulders. At 11:59, she heard the second set of engines. They came from 3 directions simultaneously. Vans, 4 of them, without markings, sealing the exits in sequence with the mechanical precision of something that had been rehearsed. She watched them position themselves and understood immediately and completely that the trap was exactly what she'd theorized it was. At 12:01, the shooting started. The first shots came from the container stacks on the west side. Sniper positions, she understood, placed to suppress response while the vans closed in. She heard Maddox's security responding, heard the sharp, organized return fire of people who were trained for exactly this, and still hadn't been trained enough to anticipate this. And she tracked the fight by sound, while she tracked the space by sight. She saw him. He'd gotten out of the lead vehicle when the shooting started. Wrong instinct, she thought, should have stayed down, and was moving along the north side of his convoy toward the cover of a container stack, with one security figure beside him and another down already. She saw the gunman on the east container roof a full 2 seconds before the gunman had his angle. She had not planned this. There was no plan. There was only the specific physical reality of where she was standing and where Maddox was and where the gunman was, and the distance between them and what could be covered in the time available. She ran, not toward Maddox, toward the east container stack's base, angling to cross the gunman's line of sight before the shot fired. She didn't scream. She didn't announce herself. She simply moved with the single-minded efficiency of someone who had stopped calculating risk because the calculation was already complete. She saw the muzzle flash before she felt anything. Then she felt everything. She hit the ground and understood from the quality of the pain that she'd been hit at least once, possibly twice, in the left side and the left shoulder. She registered this information with the detached precision of someone in shock and noted that she was still conscious, which she understood was important. She heard the gunman fall. She didn't see why. Maddox's security, she assumed, finally having the angle. She heard shouting. She heard Maddox's voice closer than expected, saying words she couldn't separate from the ringing in her ears. She lay on the cold concrete of the dock with the lake wind on her face and looked up at the sky, which was dark and without stars, the clouds low and thick over the city. She thought with perfect clarity, he is not going to understand this. She thought, that's all right. She thought, I need to leave. She didn't know how this was possible. She was bleeding on the ground, 2 gunshot wounds, and her left arm wasn't responding to instructions. But the thought was clear and urgent and felt like the most important thought she'd had in 6 weeks of marriage to a man who had described her as disposable. She was not going to be here when he reached her. She found her right hand on the cold concrete. She found leverage. She thought about all the times in her life she had been told, in various ways, that she was not the kind of person things happened to, the kind of person who mattered in the rooms she was in. She thought about the wedding ring on her finger. She pulled it off with fingers that were slippery and cold, and she set it on the concrete where she'd been lying. Then she used the container wall and everything she had left to get to her feet, and she moved toward the water, toward the narrow service corridor she'd noted on her way in, and she disappeared into the dark. Behind her, she heard Maddox's voice saying her name, for the first time. Just her name. Nothing else. She kept moving. The water was the first thing she heard clearly after the ringing stopped. The lake moved against the dock pilings with a low, patient sound, indifferent to the gunfire and the shouting and the smell of cordite that still hung in the cold air above the shipping yard. Delaney pressed her back against the concrete wall of the service corridor and breathed through her nose in the careful, deliberate way of someone managing pain that had become large enough to require management. Her left shoulder had stopped feeling like a shoulder. It felt like a separate object attached to her body by increasingly unreliable means. The wound in her left side, lower, below the ribs, was the one that worried her more. It was wet in a way that her coat was not thick enough to hide, and when she pressed her right hand against it, the pressure produced a sound in her head that was very close to white. She breathed. She needed to move. She understood this with the flat, operational clarity that the body produces when it has bypassed the emotional layer entirely and is communicating directly in terms of physics. She was bleeding in 2 places in January on a dock in Chicago, and she needed to move. She pushed off the wall with her right hand and her legs held, which she noted with something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The service corridor ran 40 yards south before it opened onto a maintenance road that paralleled the dock's perimeter fence. She'd noted it on her way in. The kind of thing she noticed now as a matter of habit, exits and adjacencies, the geography of places that might require leaving quickly. She moved along the corridor with her right hand against the wall for balance and her left arm pressed against her side, and she thought about nothing except the next 10 feet of ground. Behind her, from the direction of the central loading area, she could still hear activity, voices, the sound of vehicles, someone issuing instructions in a clipped tone she recognized as one of Maddox's security chiefs. She heard her name once more, from a distance, thrown out like a question the dark wasn't going to answer. She reached the maintenance road and turned south without stopping. There was a payphone, an actual payphone, the city's infrastructure running years behind its own decommissioning schedule, on the corner of a side street 2 blocks from the dock's south gate. She'd seen it from the car on the way in and filed it away with the same automatic instinct. She reached it in 11 minutes. It took her 4 attempts to dial because her right hand was shaking in a way she couldn't entirely control, and she was aware that this was bad information about her condition, but she kept dialing until the number connected. Her father picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with sleep, and then instantly not rough at all when he heard her say his name. "Del, don't talk," she said. "Listen. I need you to come get me, and I need you to not ask me anything until we're in the car. Corner of Lakeshore and Meridian. There's a pawn shop with a green sign. I'll be in the doorway." A silence that lasted 1 second. 20 minutes, he said. He made it in 17. She watched the headlights of his 20-year-old Buick come around the corner and felt something in her chest shift in a way that had nothing to do with the wounds, and she pressed it back down because this was not the moment for it. He saw her when he got out of the car, and his face did something she'd seen it do only twice before in her life. Once when her mother died, and once when a man twice his size had put a gun to his head in a parking garage in 2019. He crossed the space between them in 4 steps and caught her by the right arm when her knees decided they'd done enough. "Hospital," he said immediately. "No." "Delaney, no hospital. They'll report it, and then there are questions, and then—" She stopped and breathed. "Not a hospital. You know someone." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained more guilt than she had the patience for right now. He did know someone. He'd known someone for 20 years, the same underground medical contacts that everyone in his world knew when the situation required discretion. He'd always hoped she would never need to know he knew them. "Get in the car," he said. The man her father drove her to was named Clement, and he worked out of an apartment in Bridgeport with the kind of organized calm of someone who had been doing this long enough to have developed systems. He was 60, stocky, with hands that moved with a steadiness that had nothing to do with emotion. He cut away her coat and her shirt with a pair of shears and examined her wounds under a light bright enough to make her squint. "2," he said. "I know. The shoulder is through and through. You're lucky. Missed the joint, missed the subclavian." He pressed something against the side wound, and she made a sound she hadn't intended to make. "This one's still in there. Going to need to come out tonight." "Then take it out tonight." He looked at her over the top of the light, with the expression of a man recalibrating. "You want something for the pain first." "Obviously," she said. Her father sat in Clement's kitchen while Clement worked, and she could see him through the doorway, sitting at the table with his hands around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, his head bent slightly, his shoulders carrying the particular weight of a man doing the arithmetic on his choices. She watched him through the half-open door while Clement did what Clement needed to do, and she kept her breathing steady and her eyes open because she was afraid that if she closed them, the arithmetic would become her arithmetic, and she wasn't ready for that yet. When it was done and she was bandaged and dressed in a clean shirt from Clement's supply of anonymous clothing, she sat on the edge of the exam table and told herself this was the worst she would feel, that from this point forward, the direction was up. She told herself this with the focused, slightly desperate conviction of someone who needed to believe it to function. Clement stood at the doorway with his shears and looked at her with the professional detachment of a man who had learned not to ask questions and then said, "Whoever you belong to is going to come looking." "I don't belong to anyone," she said. He looked at her. "He's going to come looking for me," she corrected. "I know." She spent 4 days in her father's apartment on the south side. Clement came twice to change the dressings and check the wounds, and her father brought her soup and medicine and didn't ask questions with his mouth, only with his eyes, constantly, in a way she answered by not dying. On the second day, Maddox called her father's phone. Eddie brought it to her without a word and stood in the doorway while she looked at the screen. She let it ring. When it stopped, she handed the phone back to her father, and he put it in his pocket and went back to the kitchen without a word. And that was the entirety of the conversation between them about it. On the fourth day, she could sit up without the room shifting. On the fifth day, she walked to the window and back and decided that was enough. She called her father in from the kitchen and had him sit across from her at the small table where she'd eaten 1,000 meals in the years after her mother was gone, where the table's surface still had the mark from the hot pot her mother had set directly on the wood in the last summer before everything went wrong. "I need money," she said. "Whatever you have." He looked at his hands. "How much is whatever?" "Everything, all of it." His jaw tightened. He was quiet for a moment. "Del, I'm not asking you to explain yourself about any of it," she said. "I know what happened. I know how we got here. I'm not interested in the history right now. I need to know how much you actually have." He named a number. It was small. She'd expected smaller. "Okay," she said. "Where are you going?" She looked at him. He was 61 years old, and he looked older. The particular aging of men who had lived at the edge of things too long, who had made too many transactions in the dark and spent too many years carrying the weight of them. She had his jaw, she knew, the stubborn geometry of it. She'd always been grateful for that. "Somewhere I can work," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands again. "I'm sorry," he said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "It's okay." It wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for now, and she needed to conserve what she had for the work ahead. She left Chicago on a Tuesday morning in February, 6 weeks after the wedding, 7 days after the docks. She took a bus because she was not ready to put her name on a plane ticket, and she sat in the window seat for 14 hours and watched the country change and thought about the notebook in the Vescari Estate Library and hoped no one found it before it became irrelevant. In the third week of March, from a furnished room in a city she was not yet ready to name even to herself, she called the one person she thought might help without asking too many questions. A woman named Audra Fenn, a former classmate from her business degree program who had gone into logistics consulting and who had, over the years of their loose and infrequent friendship, occasionally described the work she did in a way that made it sound like the kind of thing that could be done from anywhere by someone who understood how supply chains actually worked versus how they were supposed to work. Audra answered on the second ring. "Del," she said, with the particular neutrality of someone who has been waiting for a call without knowing they were waiting. "I heard something happened." "I need a job," Delaney said, "or a project, or an introduction, something I can work into something real." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I will be." That's a different answer than yes. "I know." Audra was quiet for a moment. "I have a client. Mid-size freight operation trying to renegotiate their Pacific Northwest port contracts. They need someone who can read the structure of what they currently have and figure out where the losses are coming from. It's not glamorous. That's fine. It pays in the range of, that's also fine. Another pause. "When can you start?" "Whenever you need me to." That was March. By June, she had found 3 structural inefficiencies in the freight company's routing contracts that their own logistics team had missed for 2 years, and the money they saved in the first quarter was enough to justify a full-time consulting position that paid twice what the initial project had offered. By September, she had 2 additional clients through referrals. By December, she had incorporated a small firm under the name Hartwell Logistics Consulting. Vivian Hartwell, proprietor, a name she had chosen from the middle pages of a novel she'd been reading in February in a furnished room when the need for a name had become practical. She was not hiding, exactly. She was condensing. She was becoming smaller and more precise and more functional, the way a thing becomes when it is under pressure and is made of the right material. She was also watching. Back in Chicago, she tracked the aftermath through the channels available to her. Financial filings, news coverage of the kind that appeared between the lines of legitimate reporting, the occasional piece of information that made its way through the network of people who moved around the edges of the organized world and talked to each other in the careful, coded way of people who understood that information was currency. She learned that Raphael had been exposed within 48 hours of the dock ambush, not by Maddox's investigation, but by the ambush's failure itself. The Petrov Group, furious at the botched operation, had made contact with a commission intermediary and attempted to renegotiate their arrangement with a different Viscari figure, which had been precisely the wrong move and had served as a comprehensive confession. She heard that Raphael was gone from the estate by the end of January. She heard nothing about what happened to him after that, and didn't ask. She learned that Maddox had survived the docks without serious injury. She processed this information with the same neutral efficiency she applied to all the other data and did not examine it more closely than that. She heard, in the spring, that he had been looking for her, not through official channels, no police report, no public appeal, nothing that would draw attention to the circumstances of her disappearance. Discreet inquiries through the network her father moved in, a significant amount of money offered for information about her location. Her father told her this on a phone call in April, his voice careful, waiting for her reaction. "How much?" she said. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "Don't take it," she said. "But Del, I'm not going to—" "I know you're not. I'm saying it anyway." She heard him exhale. "He's not going to stop." "He can keep looking," she said. "That's his business." "He seemed—" Her father stopped. "What?" "The man who came to see me. He said Maddox seemed like something was wrong with him, not in a dangerous way, in a—" Another stop. "Said he seemed like a man who'd lost something and didn't know how to look for it right." Delaney sat in her office in Seattle, a real office by then, a suite on the 8th floor with a view of the Sound and a staff of 6 people who called her Ms. Hartwell and who did not know anything about her except what she'd given them, and looked at the water. "That's not my problem," she said. She said it the way you say a thing when you're still deciding whether it's true. She kept working. She kept building. She hired people who were good at specific things, and she paid them well, and she gave them enough structure to work within and enough autonomy to exceed expectations. And the firm grew in the particular way that good operations grow. Not explosively, but steadily, each quarter slightly larger than the last, each new client slightly more significant, and she kept learning. The freight work had given her a comprehensive education in the mechanics of logistics, how goods moved, how documentation worked, how the gap between what a shipment was listed as and what it actually contained could be managed and exploited. She understood, from her years of ambient absorption in the Viscari world, that the mechanics of legitimate logistics and the mechanics of illegitimate ones were in most respects identical. The difference was in what moved and who knew it was moving. She began, in her second year in Seattle, to look at the Viscari organization's legitimate business infrastructure with the focused attention of someone who had decided it was time to stop watching and start doing. It was meticulous work. It required patience and precision and the specific kind of intelligence that understood corporate structures not as abstract entities, but as physical systems, where the load-bearing walls were, where the redundancies existed, where the vulnerabilities accumulated in the places no one thought to look, because the places no one thought to look were the places that the people who had built the structure had also stopped looking at. She was good at it. She discovered, exceptionally good at it, in the way that people are sometimes exceptionally good at things they've spent years preparing for without knowing they were preparing. She found the first company, a property holding group that laundered Viscari profits through residential development, in the 3rd month of looking. She acquired a controlling interest through 3 layers of holding companies over the course of 6 months, moving slowly and buying in quantities that didn't trigger reporting thresholds. And when the transfer was complete, she sat in her office and looked at the documentation and understood that she had just taken from Maddox Viscari a piece of infrastructure that had been generating $2 million a year in clean money. She felt nothing dramatic about this. She felt the particular satisfaction of a calculation that had resolved correctly. She found the second company 3 months after that, and then the third. By the end of the second year, she had acquired or positioned herself to acquire 17 separate entities connected to the Viscari financial network, with a combined annual cash flow that represented roughly 30% of the organization's legitimate revenue streams. And still he hadn't found her. She had been careful, but she had also been helped, she understood, by something she had identified in the Viscari organization's structure during her months in the estate. The particular blind spot of powerful men who built systems around the assumption that the people who couldn't see them also couldn't affect them. Maddox was looking for Delaney Cross, the Southside bookmaker's daughter, the quiet woman in the East Wing, the human shield in the $14,000 dress. He was not looking for Vivian Hartwell. He was not looking in boardrooms and acquisition filings and the quiet, patient demolition of his financial infrastructure by someone who had learned his world from the inside out and had spent 2 years building the tools to take it apart. She had been invisible her whole life. She had decided to use that one last time and then never again. In the spring of her 3rd year, she got a call from Audra Fenn. Not about work. "Someone's been asking about you," Audra said. Her voice had a quality that wasn't quite warning, but was close. "Not with your real name, but the description, what kind of asking? Careful asking, the kind that knows how not to look like asking." A pause. "Del, it's someone from Chicago." Delaney set down the pen she'd been holding and looked at the sound through the window. "I know," she said. "You knew?" "I knew he'd find it eventually," she breathed. "How close is he?" "Close enough that I thought you should know before he does." She sat for a moment. She thought about the documentation she'd compiled over 2 years, the ownership transfers, the acquisition records, the evidence of what she'd done and how she'd done it. She thought about the 2 documents she'd had drawn up 6 months ago by a lawyer in Vancouver who did not know who she was and who had been paid in a manner that ensured he would not remember the transaction. She thought about Maddox's voice at the docks, saying her name in the dark after she was gone. She'd thought about that voice more than she intended to. She'd examined it from every angle and never fully resolved it into something that fit neatly into the structure she'd built around herself. It didn't matter. The structure wasn't built around what she felt. It was built around what she'd decided, on a bench in an anteroom in a white dress, with the sound of her husband's voice coming through a heating vent, describing her function in his life with the casual precision of a man discussing weather. She had decided something in that moment that she'd been executing for 3 years. The execution was nearly complete. "Tell him I'm in Seattle," she said. Audra went quiet. "Tell him exactly where to find me," Delaney said. "Give him the address of the office." "Del, I'm ready," she said. "I've been ready?" She hung up and looked at the sound and thought about what was coming. She thought about the woman who had stood in front of the mirror in the anteroom and taken inventory, who had removed 11 pins from her hair and sat alone in a room that wasn't hers with a wedding ring on her finger and the specific exhausting weight of having loved the wrong thing for too long. That woman was not entirely gone. She was still in here somewhere, in the part that had noticed the sound of her name and his voice at the docks, and hadn't been able to entirely metabolize it. She was still in there, carrying what she was always going to carry. But she was no longer in charge. Vivian Hartwell pulled the 2 documents from the drawer of her desk. She set them side by side on the surface and looked at them for a moment. Clean paper, precise language, the legal architecture of an ending that had been 3 years in construction. She put them in the folder she'd prepared for this. She closed the folder. Then she went back to work, because there were 3 more things she needed to finish before he arrived, and Delaney Cross had never left anything half done in her life. He was going to walk through her door. She was going to be ready for him in a way he had never been ready for anything. And this time, when he looked at her, he was going to... He arrived on a Thursday. She knew before her assistant told her, the way you know certain things when you have spent 3 years calibrating yourself to a specific frequency, the slight shift in the quality of attention from the reception desk below. the particular silence that preceded the elevator announcement. She was standing at the window with her coffee when Nora's voice came through the intercom with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they understood was significant without knowing why. "Ms. Hartwell, there's a man downstairs who doesn't have an appointment. He says his name is Maddox Vescari and that you're expecting him." Delaney looked at the sound. The water was gray today, the way it was most mornings in March, flat and without definition. The sky and the surface almost the same color. "Send him up," she said. She set her coffee down. She moved to her desk and sat in her chair. Her chair, the one she had chosen herself from a showroom on Pine Street, high-backed and precise. The chair of a woman who had decided what kind of space she occupied. She opened the folder and placed both documents on the desk's surface, the divorce decree on the left and the asset transfer on the right, and she set her hands flat on the desk on either side of them and waited. The elevator opened at 9:03. He looked the same. That was the first thing she registered, with the involuntary, almost clinical precision of someone who had prepared for this moment and was now discovering the distance between preparation and reality. He looked the same and also different in the way that 3 years always changed people. He was leaner, or perhaps it was the quality of how he carried himself that made him seem leaner, something compressed and tight that hadn't been there before. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that she didn't remember. His hair was slightly longer. He wore a charcoal coat over a dark suit, no tie. He looked like a man who had dressed for a meeting that he expected to be difficult. He stopped when he saw her. She watched him take in the office, the 8th floor view, the clean lines of a space that communicated competence and scale without performing it. The staff she could see through the glass wall of the open plan area, moving through their Thursday morning with the organized efficiency of people who trusted the structure they worked in. She watched him read all of this the way he read rooms, with the rapid, professional assessment of a man whose survival had always depended on understanding his environment before it understood him. Then he looked at her. "Vivian Hartwell," he said. "That's the name on the door," she said. He crossed the office and sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited to, which she had expected. He sat the way he always sat, with the particular quality of physical authority that some men were simply born with, and others spent lifetimes unsuccessfully trying to acquire. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, relaxed, which meant he was not relaxed. He looked at the 2 documents on the desk between them. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. "You've been taking my companies," he said. "Acquiring legally available equity in entities that were inadequately protected," she said. "Yes?" 17 of them. 19. The last 2 cleared escrow on Tuesday. Something moved across his face. Not anger. She had expected anger and would have known how to work with anger. This was something more complicated, a recalculation happening in real time, the specific expression of a man who had arrived at a destination and found the geography entirely different from the map. 3 years, he said. "Yes. While I was looking for you." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved from the documents to her face and stayed there, and she held the look with the steadiness she had spent 3 years building, not because the look didn't cost her anything, but because she had decided long ago that the cost was not going to be visible. "The docs," he said. "I'm not interested in discussing the docs." "I am." "I understand that," she said. "The documents in front of you take precedence." His jaw tightened. It was the first crack in the surface, and she noted it the way she noted everything, without reaction, as data. "You took a bullet for me," he said. "I made a tactical decision," she said. "In the moment. It doesn't create an obligation, and I'm not presenting it as one." "Delaney." "Vivienne," she said quietly, precisely. "In this office." The silence that followed had texture. He looked at her across the desk, across the 2 documents, across 3 years of distance, and she could see him working through something, turning it over, trying to find the angle that gave him purchase. "Who helped you?" he said finally. "The acquisitions, the structure, this." He gestured slightly at the office, the building, the infrastructure of what she'd built. "You didn't do this alone." "I did most of it alone," she said. "The rest I paid for. People tend to work very hard for someone who pays them what they're worth and doesn't treat them like furniture." The last word landed. She saw it land. He didn't look away. Sign the documents, she said. Both of them. The divorce decree first, then the asset transfer. The transfer confirms the 19 acquisitions as legitimate and waives any claim the Viscari organization might make against Hartwell Logistics and its subsidiaries. In exchange, I retain no further claim on Viscari assets, and I take no action with the Commission regarding the Raphael incident or anything else I observed during our marriage. He looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. And if I don't sign, then the package I've prepared, which documents the full financial structure of Viscari operations, the Commission relationships, the property holding arrangements, and 3 years of acquisition activity that your accountants failed to flag, goes to the appropriate federal authorities on Monday morning. She held his gaze. I've been very thorough. I had a lot of time. He breathed. She watched his chest move. You'd destroy the whole organization, he said. I'd hand the documentation to people who would destroy it, she said. The distinction matters to me. Why does the distinction matter to you? She paused for 1 second. Because I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to finish something. He looked at her face. The look was different from any look he'd given her before. Not the administrative assessment of their wedding, not the polished dismissal of his office 6 weeks into their marriage, not the calculated management of 100 social events. This was something stripped down, direct. The look of a man who had run out of the particular kind of performance that power required and was sitting, for possibly the first time, in front of someone he could not manage. I need to know something, he said. His voice had changed, not softer exactly. It was still the same fundamental tone, measured and low, but the careful distance was gone from it. The documents, before I sign anything, he said. I need to know something. She waited. Did you do all of this? He stopped. Started again. The docs, the disappearing, the 3 years, the companies. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. Was any of it because you wanted to hurt me, or was it only because you had to? The question was not what she'd prepared for. She had prepared for anger, negotiation, threats, the deployment of whatever leverage he'd calculated he could bring to bear. She had not prepared for that question, asked in that tone, by a man who looked like he actually needed the answer. She sat with it. The honest answer was complex in the way that all honest answers to questions like that were complex. The honest answer contained the anteroom and the heating vent, and his voice describing her function with the brisk economy of a man discussing logistics. It contained the dock and the cold concrete and her wedding ring placed in the pool of her own blood. It contained 19 acquisition files and 3 years of the specific, absorbing work of becoming something no one had expected her to become. The honest answer also contained the sound of her name in his voice, thrown into the dark at the docks, and the fact that she had thought about that sound more than she had intended to for 3 years. She opened her mouth to give him the strategic answer, the one that served the outcome she'd built toward, the one that kept the distance intact and the structure clean. And then Nora's voice came through the intercom again. Ms. Hartwell, I'm sorry to interrupt. There are 3 men in the lobby. They don't have appointments. Nora's voice changed in a way that made Delaney's spine go straight. They're asking for Mr. Viscari. Maddox was already standing. He moved to the window, not the exterior window, the interior glass wall that looked out over the open plan area and down to the lobby visible through the atrium, and looked down. And something happened in his face that she had never seen before. A swift, total absence of the controlled surface. Raw recognition. How did they know you were here, she said, because she knew immediately from his expression that these men were not his. I was followed. He said it without inflection, already scanning the office layout. From the airport. I made a mistake. What kind of mistake? He looked at her. The Petrov Group. They've been rebuilding for 2 years. They know I've been looking for you, and they've been waiting for me to find you. He said the next part with a precision that felt like the most honest thing he'd ever said to her directly. I led them here. I'm sorry. For 1 second, the whole construction she'd built, the office, the name, the 3 years of careful, precise work, felt very fragile. She could feel it the way you felt a structure when the ground shifted under it, the vibration moving up through the floor into the soles of her feet. Then she felt something else. Cold. Clear. Functional. How many in the building? Nora said 3 in the lobby. There will be more outside. He was already moving toward her desk, checking the office layout with the rapid assessment of a man doing threat calculation. Service entrance? West stairwell. Coded keycard. She was already pulling the keycard from her desk drawer. Nora. Ms. Hartwell. Code 7, Delaney said into the intercom. Get everyone out through the east stairs, now. Don't call the police yet. Yes, ma'am. She heard the controlled movement begin outside the glass wall. Nora's voice, efficient and low, the sound of chairs pushing back, the particular quality of people who had been trained for exactly this moving into the protocol she had quietly built into this office's operational structure 18 months ago, when she had understood that what she was doing would eventually attract exactly this kind of attention. She'd built a code 7. She'd trained her staff for it. She'd done it without telling anyone why, because the why was not a conversation she'd been ready to have. She was ready now. She picked up the 2 documents from her desk and put them in the interior pocket of her jacket. She looked at Maddox across the desk. The west stairwell, she said. 6 floors down to the service level, there's a parking structure with an exit onto Commerce. Can you drive? Yes. There's a gray Volvo on level 2, spot 44. She held out the keycard. Go. He didn't move. He was looking at her with that stripped-down look again, the one she hadn't prepared for. You built a contingency for this, he said. I built contingencies for several things. You knew this could happen. I knew my work would have consequences. I planned accordingly. She held the key card out again. Maddox, go. He took the card. His fingers touched hers when he took it. A brief, incidental contact, the kind that carried no intention and somehow still cost something. Then they moved. The west stairwell was clean. They went down in a controlled descent, her shoulder protesting the pace in the particular way it always protested sudden movement. And she put her hand against the railing and managed it and kept moving because management was what she did. They reached the service level in 4 minutes. The parking structure was dim and smelled of concrete and exhaust, and she moved quickly to level 2 with Maddox a half step behind her, checking corners with the instinctive pattern of someone whose body had been trained for this. Spot 44. The gray Volvo sat where she'd left it that morning, anonymous, reliable, full tank, because she'd made a habit of keeping a full tank since February 3 years ago when she'd left Chicago on a bus. He got in the driver's side. She got in the passenger seat because her shoulder would make driving painful and because she was already on her phone. Who are you calling? He said, pulling out of the spot. Someone who needs to know my location has been compromised, she said, and someone else who is going to file a very specific set of documents with a federal repository in the next hour as a precautionary measure. He glanced at her. The Volvo moved toward the Commerce Street exit, smooth and unhurried, because the only thing worse than being followed was being followed while moving fast. That's the commission documentation, he said. The package you were going to use Monday. It's going into the repository as insurance, not as a filing, she said. It only becomes accessible if something happens to me. She looked at him steadily. So it would be in your interest, and in the interest of anyone connected to you, to make sure nothing happens to me. The silence in the car was different from the silence in the office, smaller, more compressed. That's very smart, he said. I know. You built all of that before you told Audra to give me your address. Yes, you knew I might bring this with me, the Petrov exposure. I considered it a possibility. He drove. The Commerce Street exit opened onto the street and he turned south without asking, merging into Thursday morning traffic with the ease of someone who understood that the correct way to disappear in a city was to move at the same speed as everything else around you. Where are we going? He said. I need 20 minutes in a place that isn't my office, she said. There's a parking structure on 5th. Drive there. He drove. She made her calls, 2 of them, brief and specific, to people whose functions she didn't explain to him and whose names she used only in the abbreviated way of people with real working relationships. When she hung up, she put her phone in her jacket pocket and looked at the street and thought about what had just happened. She had prepared for this meeting for 3 years. She had constructed the documentation, the legal architecture, the leverage, the exit strategy. She had prepared for his anger and his negotiation and his attempt to reclaim control of a situation she had carefully arranged to be unrecoverable from his perspective. She had not prepared for him to lead the Petrov group to her door. She had not prepared for the office evacuation, the stairwell, the gray Volvo moving through Thursday morning traffic with Maddox Viscari's hands on the wheel, and 3 years of careful distance suddenly reduced to the width of a center console. She turned this over in her mind, examining it from all sides, looking for the version of events in which this changed the outcome she'd built toward. She couldn't find it. The outcome was still the same. The documents were in her jacket. The repository filing was in process. The leverage remained intact. But the ground had shifted. The meeting she'd choreographed, her office, her desk, her terms delivered from a position of complete structural advantage, had been replaced by this: a car. A man she'd spent 3 years dismantling sitting 2 feet away from her, and the first unscripted thing that had happened to her in a long time. She thought about what he'd asked her in the office, just before Nora's voice came through the intercom. Was any of it because you wanted to hurt me? Or was it only because you had to? She hadn't answered. She was aware, with the honest, uncomfortable awareness that she couldn't turn off, that the fact she hadn't answered was itself an answer. If the answer had been simple, she would have given it without hesitation, because simple answers served the purpose of the meeting, and she was very good at using what served her purpose. She hadn't answered because the honest answer was not simple, and she had made a rule 3 years ago about being honest with herself, even when the honesty was inconvenient, and she was not willing to break that rule even now, even in this, even for this. The parking structure on 5th was dim and half empty at 9:30 on a Thursday morning. He pulled into a space on the second level and cut the engine, and they sat in the sudden quiet. She turned to face him. She had the folder with the 2 documents in her jacket. She had the leverage. She had the repository filing moving through the process in real time. She had everything she'd built toward. She also had the memory of his hands at the altar, dry, cool, technically appropriate, and the very different memory of his voice saying her name in the dark at the shipping docks, and 3 years of a question she'd refused to finish answering even to herself. She looked at him. He was looking back at her in the way he'd been looking at her in the office, stripped down, without the surface, the look of a man who had stopped trying to manage what she thought of him. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She waited. "I know what I did," he said. "I know what I said to Hollis the night before the wedding. I know you heard it." He said this with the flat certainty of someone who had been through the calculation enough times to have arrived at certainty. "I've known since before you disappeared that you heard it. The vent in the anteroom. I should have checked it. I didn't." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to understand why I said what I said," he continued. "The operational logic was real. I believed it when I said it. I also—" He stopped. The careful architecture of his phrasing showed a crack. "I was wrong about what you were. I categorized you before I knew you. I do that. I categorize people and I act on the category, and I don't—" Another stop, shorter. "I don't revise. Or I didn't." The air in the car was cold and close and smelled of upholstery and the city outside. "In the 6 weeks you were in my house," he said, "I learned things about you that I did not expect to learn. The way you moved through the estate. The way you listened. The way you came to my office with what you'd found about Raphael. No evidence, no leverage, nothing to gain from it, and told me anyway because you believed it was real and you thought I should know." He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. "I dismissed you. I did it in the specific, efficient way I dismiss things that don't fit my categories. And 3 hours later, you were at the shipping docks." The silence stretched. "I heard you leave," he said. "The night you went to the docks. I was awake. I heard the east wing side door." He looked at her. "I didn't follow you. I told myself it wasn't relevant. I went back to sleep." Something hit her in the chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Something older than both. "And then at the docks," he said, you ran toward the gunman." "I told you. I know what you told me," he said. "Tactical decision. In the moment." He shook his head slightly. "I've made a lot of tactical decisions in my life. I know what they feel like. What you did at those docks was not a calculation." She looked at the concrete pillar in front of the windshield and said nothing. "I held your wedding ring for 8 months," he said. "I carried it in my jacket. He stopped, and she heard something in the stop that she hadn't heard from him before, a roughness at the edge of the control. I don't expect you to care about that. I'm not telling you because I expect it to change anything. I'm telling you because you asked me to see you from the beginning. That's what you wanted, to be seen accurately as what you actually were. And I couldn't do it then. He looked at her directly. I'm doing it now. The words sat in the car. She thought about the anteroom, the bench, 11 pins in her hair and a dish towel in her hands in her father's kitchen, and 8 years of a feeling she'd talked herself out of and into and out of again, like a woman pacing the same room. She thought about the notebook in the library, the gray Volvo with a full tank, 19 acquisition files, Vivian Hartwell, proprietor. She thought about what it had cost her to build all of this, the shoulder that ached in cold weather, the nights in furnished rooms, the specific grinding loneliness of becoming someone new in a city where no one knew what you'd left behind. She reached into her jacket and took out the folder. She set it on the console between them. She opened it and looked at the 2 documents. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at Maddox, and she said the thing she'd been carrying for 3 years that was neither strategy nor sentiment, but something more fundamental than either, the thing she'd have given anything not to still feel, and couldn't. The answer to your question, she said, is both. He was completely still. I needed to do it, she said, and I wanted to. She looked at the documents. I wanted to because of what you said through that vent, because of the way you looked at me at the altar like I was a delivery that had arrived on time, because of Celeste Vale in the green dress and 30 words a day in the East Wing. She breathed. And because I had loved you for 8 years and you never once looked at me like I was a person, and when I finally mattered enough for you to notice me, it was as a piece of operational equipment, and that... She stopped. Her voice was steady. She was going to keep it steady. That required a response. He said nothing. He was watching her with an intensity that she felt physically. But I also needed to do it, she said, because it was the only way I could become this. She indicated the folder, the car, the city outside, the person sitting in this seat. I couldn't have become this without the thing I was responding to. I needed the anger, and I needed the work, and I needed the distance, and I needed to prove to myself, only to myself, that I was not the woman he'd described through that vent, that I was never that woman, that the category was wrong from the beginning. She closed the folder. And now I've proved it, she said, to myself, conclusively. She looked at him. So sign the documents, she said, and then we're finished. He looked at the folder. He looked at her face. And then he said the thing that destroyed the next 30 seconds of everything she'd planned. What if I don't want to be finished? The words fell into the car like something dropped from a great height. She stared at him. I have spent 3 years looking for you, he said, not to recover the companies, not for the organization, not for any operational reason. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him something. She could hear it. Because you left a ring on a dock and disappeared, and I understood in that moment, standing in the rain with a pool of your blood at my feet, that I had thrown away the only person who had ever seen me accurately and acted on what they saw, regardless of the personal cost. She opened her mouth. I know, he said. I know it doesn't change what I did. I know it doesn't erase the anteroom or the dismissal or 6 weeks of treating you like furniture. I know the accounting of that doesn't resolve in my favor. I'm not asking you to forgive a debt. I'm telling you something true about what the last 3 years have been for me, because you told me something true, and you deserve the same. The parking structure was very quiet. Delaney Cross, Vivian Hartwell, sat in the passenger seat of her own car with a folder containing 3 years of work in her hands, and looked at the man across the console and felt the specific, terrible weight of being seen by someone too late and knowing it and not being entirely able to close the door on it even now. She had not prepared for this. She was a person who prepared for everything. Maddox, she said, and her voice was still steady, and she was going to keep it steady if it was the last thing she did. What happened at the docks? What I did? Doesn't make us even. What I built in 3 years doesn't make us even. What you just told me doesn't make us even. There is no version of even that applies to what this was. I know. Then you understand why I need you to sign the documents. He looked at the folder. Yes, he said, and you'll sign them. The pause that followed was perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she could feel every year and every mile and every acquisition file and every morning she had woken up in a city that wasn't hers and made herself into something new, and she could feel all of it balanced against the sound of her name in the dark at the shipping docks, and she understood with total clarity that this was the moment, not the office meeting she'd planned, not the choreographed presentation of leverage and legal architecture, but this parking structure, this cold and quiet morning, this pause, that was going to determine everything. He reached for the folder, and then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, Chicago area code. She answered. The voice on the other end said 4 words in the flat, specific tone of someone delivering information that had no softening possible. They have your father. The folder slipped from her fingers onto the floor of the car, and for the first time in 3 years, Vivian Hartwell felt the ground go completely out from under her. Not the managed, calculated shift she'd felt in the office when the Petrov men appeared in the lobby, but the real thing, the total freefall of someone whose most carefully protected blind spot has just been found. The folder was on the floor of the car, and her father was somewhere in Chicago, and the voice on the phone was still talking. She picked the folder up. She did this first, before she said anything, before she processed anything. She picked up the folder and held it in her lap and pressed her hand flat against it because she needed something physical to press against. And then she said very quietly, "Say that again." The voice said it again. 4 words, same order, same tone. "Where?" she said. "We'll be in touch with that." "When?" "When you're back in Chicago. Tonight. Come alone." A pause that contained something that was not quite amusement, but was in the same neighborhood. "Leave the husband." The line went dead. She held the phone against her thigh and looked at the concrete pillar in front of the windshield and breathed through her nose in the careful, deliberate way she'd learned in Clement's apartment with 2 bullets worth of damage in her body and the specific necessity of not coming apart. Maddox had not moved. He was watching her with the complete attention of someone who had read the call from her face and was waiting. "The Petrov Group has my father," she said. The quality of the silence in the car changed. "Chicago," she said. "Tonight." He was already reaching for the ignition. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She thought. She did it quickly and thoroughly, the way she'd taught herself to think over 3 years of problems that required solutions built from limited materials under time pressure. She thought about her father in his rented tuxedo at the wedding, his hand over hers on his arm, carrying the weight of what he'd done. She thought about the soup he'd brought her in the apartment on the south side, 4 days in a row, without asking questions with his mouth. She thought about Chicago area code and tonight and come alone. She thought about what come alone meant when the Petrov Group said it. "They'll kill him regardless," she said. It was not a question. She was thinking out loud in the specific, unsentimental way of someone who needed to see the actual shape of the problem. "Probably," Maddox said. His voice was level. He was not being cruel. He was matching her register because he understood that she needed accurate information, not managed information. "They want me there for a reason that isn't an exchange," she said. "They want to remove you and the documentation simultaneously," he said. "The repository filing, say, how far along is it?" "My lawyer has it. It goes into the system automatically at noon unless I send a cancellation code." He looked at the clock on the dash. 9:47. "They don't know about the repository," she said. "They know about the package as leverage, the way I described it to you in the office. They think the documentation exists as a threat I control. They don't know it's already in motion. So they think killing you kills the threat." "Yes." He thought for a moment. "What do they actually want, beyond removing you?" She looked at the folder in her lap. "The asset transfers. If I'm dead and the transfers are contested, the 19 companies revert to disputed status. It could take years to resolve legally. During those years, the Petrov Group could move into the vacuum." She breathed. "They've been trying to establish in Chicago for 3 years. If the Vescary operation is simultaneously destabilized by my documentation and by my acquisitions becoming legally contested, it's an opening. They use my organization's collapse to walk through the front door," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a bad plan," he said, with the specific, dispassionate acknowledgement of someone who respected operational competence regardless of its source. "No," she agreed. It's not. She looked at the clock. 9:49. She thought about her father in whatever room the Petrov group had put him in. She thought about his 61-year-old body and his rented tuxedo weight and the way he'd looked at the table in his apartment with his hands around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. She thought about the arithmetic he'd been doing on himself since 2019 at least, maybe longer. The specific accounting of a man who knew the ledger wasn't going to balance. She was not going to let him pay it. Not like this. I need your people, she said. Whatever you have in Chicago that can be operational tonight. He was already on his phone. They drove to the airport while he made calls and she made calls, and the gray Volvo moved through Seattle traffic with the anonymous efficiency of a car that drew no attention, and she sat with the folder in her lap, and the cold that was coming up through the floor of the car into her feet, and thought about what tonight was going to require. It was going to require her to walk into a situation that was designed to kill her. She had done that once before. She had done it without a plan, without allies, without anything except a date and a location and the raw, unorganized truth that she was not going to sit still while the situation resolved itself over her head. She was not that woman anymore. She had resources and structure and 3 years of building exactly the kind of operational capacity that her current situation required. She had Maddox, who was on his third call in the last 8 minutes, his voice clipped and precise, deploying assets with the efficient fluency of a man who had been doing this his whole life. She had the repository filing, which would land at noon regardless of what happened to her, which meant that whatever the Petrov Group's plan was, the documentation piece of it was already broken. They just didn't know yet. What she didn't have was certainty about her father's location, certainty about the Petrov Group's numbers, or certainty about whether the 3 men from her office lobby had been followed or had been the follow. She worked the problem. By the time they reached the airport, she had a partial framework. By the time they were on the plane, a charter, Maddox's, the kind of thing she had known abstractly that he had access to and was now directly grateful for. She had something closer to a plan. Not complete, not clean, but structured around the specific uncertainties in a way that left room to adapt. She sat across from him in the small cabin and laid it out. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The warehouse district on the South Lakeshore. That's where they'll have him. It's where they staged from 3 years ago. You know this. I've been investigating the Petrov Group for 2 years," he said. "I know their Chicago infrastructure better than they know I know it." He paused. "I should have moved on them 6 months ago. I didn't because I was still trying to locate you before I started a war that might make you harder to find." She looked at him. "You delayed a strategic operation," she said slowly, "because of me." He met her eyes. Yes. She processed this and put it in the category of things she would examine later, when there was a later. "The South Lakeshore Warehouse District," she said. "How specific can you get?" "Specific enough. I have a man who has been inside their operation for 14 months, he paused. "His name isn't relevant. What's relevant is that he can have a location within an hour of us landing." She nodded. "There's something you need to understand about tonight," she said. "Tell me." "My father goes home. That's the non-negotiable." She held his gaze. "Everything else, the documentation, the companies, the resolution of the commission question, all of it is secondary to that. If I have to trade the folder for his life, I trade it." "You'd give up everything you built." "I'd give up the leverage," she said. "The build stays. The 19 companies are legally mine. The documentation exists in the repository regardless. The leverage is a negotiating tool. My father is not." She breathed. "I spent 3 years building this because the alternative was having nothing. I will not trade my father for leverage. That's the one thing I won't do." He looked at her for a moment. "Understood," he said. The word was simple and complete, and she believed it in the way she believed things that she had run through enough filters to trust. They landed at O'Hare at 4 in the afternoon, Chicago time, the city gray and cold under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to rain. Maddox's people met them on the tarmac, 2 vehicles, 4 men, the particular quality of organized and professional that she recognized from the estate 3 years ago. Men who moved with the calibrated awareness of people who were always calculating the space around them. One of them handed Maddox a phone. He looked at what was on it, then handed it to her. An address. South Lakeshore Warehouse District, Building 7. Her father had been there since approximately 10 a.m. that morning, which meant they'd taken him before Maddox had even arrived in Seattle, which meant this had been planned well in advance of today, and the lobby appearance had been both a message and a trigger. She gave the phone back. "I need to go in first," she said. "They said alone. If they see a Vescari operation approaching the building, they'll—" "I know," Maddox said. "I'm not letting you go in alone." "You don't get to let me do anything," she said without heat, without emphasis. "Just fact." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. "No," he said. "You're right. I don't." He breathed. "I'm asking. Don't go in there alone." The distinction mattered. She acknowledged it with a slight nod. "Give me 10 minutes inside before you move," she said. "I'll keep them talking. I need them focused on me and the documents, not on the perimeter." He started to say something. 10 minutes, she said. "I know what I'm doing." He looked at her for a long moment. The look was the stripped down one, the one without the surface. "I know you do," he said. She got out of the car. The South Lakeshore Warehouse District at 6 in the evening was exactly what it always was. Industrial, minimal, the kind of place the city maintained without caring about, long buildings in pale concrete and corrugated steel, the lake visible in the gaps between structures, dark and flat under the gray sky. She walked 2 blocks from where the car had dropped her, her coat collar up against the wind coming off the water, the folder inside her jacket against her ribs, and she thought about nothing except the next 10 feet of ground. Building 7 had a side entrance that was unlocked, which told her they'd been watching for her and were ready. She pushed the door open and went inside. The interior was large and dim, the kind of space that had been used for storage and wasn't anymore. The floor marked with the ghost outlines of industrial shelving that had long since been removed. The light came from 4 standing lamps positioned to illuminate a specific area near the building's center. A deliberate arrangement, theatrical in the way that men who wanted to communicate control arranged things to be theatrical. Her father was in a chair in the center of the lit space. He was upright, which she assessed in the first second with the specific clinical attention of someone who needed accurate data before anything else. He looked at her when she came in, and something in his face did what faces do when they have been waiting in fear for a long time, and then the thing they were afraid would not come has come. "Del," he said. "I'm here," she said. She didn't go to him yet. She stopped at the edge of the lit space and took inventory. 5 men visible. 2 near her father, 1 at each lateral point of the warehouse, and a 5th near the far wall who was clearly the operational lead from the quality of how he held himself. A man in his 50s, compact, with the particular stillness of someone who had been in many rooms like this one and found them unremarkable. He looked at her with the assessing neutrality of a professional. "Vivian Hartwell," he said. His accent was light, Eastern European origin smoothed by years of American operation. "Or Delaney Cross. I've been reading your file." "Then you know I prefer to get to the point," she said. "The documents," he said. "The full commission package. We want it." "I know." "You brought it." "I brought the folder," she said. "What's in it is a different question." He looked at her steadily. "We're not negotiating." "You're going to want to," she said, "because at noon today the package you're looking for was filed with a federal legal repository. It's already in the system. Killing me doesn't kill it. Killing my father doesn't kill it." She held his gaze. "The only thing killing me accomplishes at this point is adding a murder charge to whatever else gets uncovered when that repository opens." The warehouse was very quiet. He looked at her for a long time. She watched him calculate. "When does it open?" he said finally. "That depends on choices that get made in this building in the next few minutes," she said. "Meaning you can stop it." "Meaning I have options," she said. "My father goes home. That's the beginning and end of my position. Everything else is negotiable." He looked at her father. He looked at her. He looked at the folder she'd taken from her jacket and was holding in her right hand. "You'd trade the folder," he said. "I'd discuss what's in the folder," she said, "after my father is out of the building." She watched him make the calculation. She watched him weigh the variables, but the repository, the folder, the operation he'd built toward for 3 years, the entry point into Chicago that kept evaporating every time he got close to it. She watched him land somewhere and couldn't tell from his face exactly where. 2 minutes, he said. He nodded to the man on her father's left. The man produced a knife and cut the zip ties on her father's wrists. Eddie Cross stood up slowly, the stiffness of a man who'd been sitting in a chair for 8 hours in the cold in his bones, and he looked at his daughter with an expression that contained more apology than she had the capacity to receive right now. "Door behind you," she said to him quietly. "Go." Dad. She held his eyes. "Go." He went. She listened to his footsteps cross the warehouse floor. She listened to the side door open and close. She breathed. She looked at the man across the lit space and understood, from the quality of how his weight had shifted in the 2 seconds since her father left the building, that the calculation had completed and had not landed where she needed it to land. She saw it in the subtle repositioning of the 2 men who had been flanking her father, moving slightly, adjusting their angles. She had known this was a possible outcome. She had planned for it. She had 10 minutes. She checked the time in her head. She'd been inside for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. She looked at the lead man and said very clearly, "Whatever you're about to do, you should know there are 12 Viscari operatives on this building's perimeter right now." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "We know about Viscari." "Do you know about the sniper on the eastern roof?" The smile stayed, but the stillness changed. "Because I don't," she said. "I'm telling you what I was told. I don't know if it's accurate. I'm suggesting you calculate whether it's worth finding out." 2 seconds. Then the far wall of the warehouse exploded inward. Not a bomb. A vehicle. A black SUV moving at speed through the corrugated steel panel, the sound of it enormous in the enclosed space, the dust and debris expanding outward in a wave that knocked the standing lamp sideways and plunged half the space into sudden shadow. The Petrov men moved immediately, trained, fast, toward positions that told her they had a response protocol for exactly this. She was already moving too, not away from the chaos, but sideways toward the support column 6 feet to her left, because she had identified that column 20 seconds after entering the building and had been tracking her distance to it with the body's automatic calculation ever since. She reached it and put her back to it and looked at the space. Maddox's people were inside. She could hear them. Controlled movement, the specific sounds of trained men working a space, and underneath that the sharper, more chaotic sounds of engagement, positions being contested, the warehouse's geography being claimed and disputed in the dark. She stayed at the column. This was the correct decision, and she knew it. She was not armed, she was operating in a space she didn't control, and the worst thing she could do was become a moving target in the dark. She heard a sound close to her left. Movement, fast. Someone coming around the column. She had the folder in her right hand and the edge of the column at her back, and nothing else. The man who came around the column was one of the 2 who had been flanking her father. He was large and he moved with the specific purposefulness of someone who had been given a specific task. He reached for her with his left hand and she drove the heel of her right palm into the bridge of his nose with everything she had, which was not enormous but was accurate, and the crack of impact was satisfying in the blunt, immediate way of things that work exactly as intended. He didn't go down. He staggered. She used the stagger to move laterally, away from the column, keeping him between her and the wall. Her shoulder screamed. The left one, the one that remembered January at the docks with perfect physical clarity, that always remembered. She ignored it with the practiced efficiency of 3 years of managing it. The man recovered faster than she'd needed him to, and came at her again, and she understood in that moment that this was not a situation she was going to win on physical terms, and so she stopped trying to win on physical terms. She threw the folder, not at him, past him, into the open space of the warehouse, where it skidded across the floor and came to rest in a patch of dim light from one of the toppled lamps. He looked at it. That was all she needed. She moved hard to his right and ran, not for the door, for the center of the space, toward the sounds of Maddox's people working the room, because the correct position was not near the wall in the dark, but in the middle of the controlled chaos that was being organized by people who were on her side. She covered 15 feet before something caught her from behind. A hand on her coat collar, brutal and efficient, yanking her backward off her feet with the physics of someone twice her size using weight and leverage. She hit the floor hard on her right side, the air going out of her, and lay there for 1 second that felt much longer with the warehouse ceiling above her and the sounds of the fight all around her and her lungs refusing to reinflate. She rolled. Right, away from where she'd fallen, because lying still was the same as being a target. She got her right hand under her and pushed, and her lungs decided to participate again, and she got air, rough and cold and tasting of dust and metal. She was on her knees when she heard Maddox's voice. Not across the warehouse. Close. 6 feet, maybe less. The voice of a man who had been covering ground and had found the specific piece of ground he was looking for. Down, he said. She went flat. The shot was close enough that she felt it in her sternum before she heard it. A single, precise report from somewhere above and to the right. The eastern roof, which meant the sniper had not been a bluff, which meant Maddox had anticipated exactly this and had positioned exactly right. The man who had yanked her down by the collar did not get up. She lay on the warehouse floor for 2 seconds and breathed and took inventory. Right side, impact. Ribs would be bruised, maybe one cracked. Left shoulder radiating pain in the way it did when she'd aggravated the scar tissue. Nothing structural. Everything functional. She got up. Maddox was beside her in the time it took her to stand, his hand on her right arm, not supporting her, checking her, the specific rapid physical assessment of someone looking for damage. I'm fine, she said. You're bleeding. She looked at her right hand, scraped from the floor, nothing significant. That's nothing. The shoulder is also nothing. She looked at the warehouse. The sounds of active engagement had diminished to something more controlled. The aftermath sounds, position secured, space being cleared. How many? We have the lead and 2 others. 2 are down. 1 got out through the west wall before we closed it. 1 got out. She thought about what 1 getting out meant. The repository filing, she said. What time is it? He looked at his phone. 7:14. The filing had been in the system since noon. 7 hours. Long enough to be irrevocable regardless of what the one who got away did with what he knew. She breathed. She looked at the folder still lying on the warehouse floor in the dim light from the toppled lamp. She walked to it and picked it up. She checked the contents. Both documents, intact, the pages unmarked by the chaos of the last however many minutes. She stood in the warehouse with the folder in her hands and Maddox 3 feet away and the sounds of his people managing the aftermath all around her, and she thought about her father walking out the side door and whether he'd found the car she'd arranged for exactly that contingency and whether he was already moving south toward the apartment on the south side where the hot pot mark was still on the kitchen table. She thought about noon and the repository and the things she'd set in motion that couldn't be stopped now regardless. She thought about the 2 documents in the folder. She looked at Maddox. He was watching her with the stripped-down look, the one she'd stopped being able to prepare adequate defenses against, the one that cost her something every time she received it and was going to keep costing her something, and she understood with cold clarity that this was simply true and would remain true, and she needed to account for it. We need to talk, she said. Not here. I know, he said. About the documents. I know. About... She stopped. She looked at the folder and then at him and understood that she had arrived at the place she'd been building toward for 3 years, and that it did not look exactly as she'd planned, and that this was going to require her to make a decision. She had been telling herself for 3 years was already made. There's a car outside, he said. Whenever you're ready. She looked at the warehouse. She looked at the folder. She looked at him. She was bleeding slightly from a scrape on her right hand, and her ribs hurt with every breath, and her shoulder was communicating its displeasure in the precise and repetitive way it had been communicating displeasure since January 3 years ago. And she was standing in a warehouse in Chicago at 7:14 in the evening with everything she had built toward in one hand and the specific unbearable weight of the things she had not built toward in her chest, and she needed to make a decision. She had always been good at decisions. She walked toward the door, and Maddox walked beside her, and outside the warehouse, the lake was dark and the city was lit against the sky, and everything that came next was going to depend on what she said in the car, and she was not ready, and she was going to do it. The car was warm. That was the first thing she noticed when she got in. The heat, immediate and specific, the kind that came from a vehicle that had been running long enough to mean it. Someone had thought about that. She didn't know if it was Maddox or one of his people, and she didn't ask, but she felt it in her hands when she folded them in her lap, the warmth coming back into her fingers slowly, the way it always did after cold. Maddox got in beside her. The driver, one of his men, anonymous and professional, pulled away from the warehouse district without being told where to go, which meant there was a destination already arranged, which meant Maddox had planned for an aftermath even when the middle of the thing was still unresolved. She noted this, filed it. They drove for several minutes without speaking. The city moved past the windows in the particular way Chicago moved at night in winter. The light orange and diffused through the cold air, the streets thinning as they went north along the lake, the water a dark presence to the right, always there, always the same. She had her phone out. She'd checked twice. Her lawyer had confirmed the repository filing at 12:04 p.m., timestamp irrevocable. The documentation existed in a federal legal system independent of anything that happened to her or the folder or the warehouse or anyone connected to any of it. She put the phone away. She looked at the folder in her lap. "My father," she said. "There's a car at his apartment," Maddox said. "Two of my people. He's home. He's been home since 7:40. She absorbed this. "You arranged that without telling me," she said. "I arranged it before we went into the warehouse," he said. "I thought it was likely he'd get out, and I thought it was likely he'd need someone outside to make sure he got home clean." She looked at the window. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, and she meant them fully, and they cost her nothing, which told her something about where she was that she hadn't been 3 hours ago. She had spent 3 years building a structure around herself that was functional and clean and protected against exactly the kind of cost she'd been paying since she was 19 years old and standing at the edge of a room watching a man she had no business loving move through it like he owned the air. She had built the structure brick by brick in furnished rooms and offices, and the long, specific silence of becoming someone new, and the structure was real. She could feel it around her now, intact, the 19 companies and the repository filing and Vivian Hartwell on the door of an 8th-floor office in Seattle. And she was not going to pretend it wasn't. But structures were not the same as answers. She had known this and had chosen to let the work substitute for knowing it, because the work was available and the answer was not. The answer was sitting 2 feet to her left in a charcoal coat with warehouse dust on the sleeve. She opened the folder. She looked at the 2 documents side by side on her lap in the moving car, the divorce decree and the asset transfer, the clean legal architecture of an ending she had spent months constructing with the specific thorough care of a person who understood that the ending needed to be airtight. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said, without looking up, "Tell me what you actually want." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something. "I want to know if what I did is something a person comes back from," he said. "Not in the abstract. With you specifically." She looked at the documents. "That's not a small question," she said. "I know. You described me as a deterrent," she said, "through a heating vent, to a fixer, the night before our wedding. You described me as a complication that made you a harder target, a disposable body." She said each phrase with the flat precision of someone reading from a record. "You chose that word, disposable." "Yes. You chose it because you believed it." "I chose it because I hadn't looked at you yet," he said. "I had a category, and I put you in it, and I spoke from the category." He paused. "That's not a defense. It's an explanation of the specific nature of what I did wrong, because I think the specific nature matters." She thought about this. "And Celeste," she said. A beat. "Celeste ended 2 months after you disappeared," he said, not as a gesture, because I couldn't maintain it. Because it required a kind of performance I stopped being able to produce. He said this carefully, the way he said things that cost him something. She understood. She was not a person who required explanation. "Are you telling me this because you think it matters to the question I asked?" "I'm telling you because you said every detail," he said. "In the parking structure, you said every detail out loud, and I owe you the same." The car moved north. The lake stayed dark to the right. She thought about the 6 weeks in the estate, the 30 words a day, the East Wing suite with its window and its view of the winter lake. She thought about the library and the notebook and the slow, accumulating weight of paying attention in the way she'd always paid attention, but had never before applied with such complete intention. She thought about standing at his office door with what she'd found about Raphael. No evidence, no leverage, nothing to gain from it, and the 3-second look he'd given her before the administrative dismissal had closed back over his face. She had seen something in that 3-second look. She had spent a long time afterward deciding it had been nothing, because deciding it had been nothing was the more useful position. She wasn't sure anymore that useful and true were the same thing. "If I sign the divorce decree," she said slowly, "the marriage ends. The legal architecture resolves cleanly. I keep the 19 companies, the repository stays in the system as a mutual deterrent, and we part with a clear accounting of what happened and what it cost." She breathed. "That's the clean outcome. The one I built toward." "I know," he said. "And if I don't sign it," she said. She let the sentence stop there. He waited. He understood that she was thinking, not performing, and he gave her the space for it with the specific patience of someone who had learned, at significant cost, what it meant to wait for a person to finish a thought. "If I don't sign it," she said, "I am making a decision about something I don't have complete information about a person who I know did one definitive thing and has since said a number of words about it. Words are—" She stopped. "I've been very good at words for 3 years. I know what words can be built to do." "Yes," he said. "I'm not sure your words are that," she said. "I don't believe you're performing. I think what you said in the parking structure and in the warehouse and in this car is true in the specific functional way that you say things that are true, without decoration, without managing toward a result." She looked at the folder. "But I've been wrong about you before, specifically and comprehensively wrong, in ways that had real physical consequences." She touched the shoulder of her left arm. Not dramatically, just a brief contact, the gesture of someone acknowledging a fact. He looked at it. "I know," he said. His voice was different now, quieter. The quality of a man who has arrived at the irreducible weight of something and is holding it without trying to put it down. "Tell me what it felt like," she said. "The ring, at the docks." He looked at the seat in front of him for a moment. "I saw you go down," he said. "I was 20 feet away, and I saw you go down, and I reached you in, I don't know, seconds, and you were gone. There was blood and your ring and the rain, and you were not there." He breathed. "I stood there for a long time. My security was trying to move me, and I stood there." He was quiet. "I'd been running operations since I was 19 years old. I'd been in rooms where people died. I'd made decisions that caused people to die. I understood the cost of those decisions in the abstract, and I had managed that understanding in the way you manage things you've decided are part of the structure of your life." He stopped. "Standing at those docks, I understood for the first time that there was a cost I was not equipped to manage, that the structure I'd built had a specific flaw I hadn't calculated for." "What flaw?" she said. "That I was capable of caring about a specific person's specific life more than I'd planned for," he said. "More than I'd allowed for. More than I thought I was." He looked at her. "I had put you in a category that did not include that possibility. And then you ran toward a gunman, and I understood that the category had been wrong from the beginning, and that being wrong about your category was going to cost me something I didn't have a name for yet." The car had slowed. She looked out the window and recognized the North Shore, the gate of the Vescari estate visible ahead, the stone wall and the bare winter trees beyond it. She looked at the driver. "I didn't tell him to come here," Maddox said. "I can redirect." She looked at the gate. The limestone facade of the house just visible beyond the trees, the pale stone and the dark wood, exactly as it had been 3 years ago. "Stop the car," she said. The driver stopped. They were idling outside the gate, the headlights on the stone. She looked at the estate. She looked at the gate. She thought about the east wing and the 11 pins and the chair by the window and the lake, dark and flat. The same lake that was dark and flat to her right now. She thought about what it would mean to go back inside. Not physically. She was not naive about what she was considering. She was not the woman who had arrived here 3 years ago in a $14,000 dress with a dish towel reflex and 8 years of a feeling she'd been talking herself into and out of. That woman had needed things she could not get from this estate, or from this man, or from any structure external to herself, and she had gone and gotten them by other means, and they were hers now, permanent and irrevocable, independent of every choice she made from this point forward. She knew who she was. She had the companies and the repository and the 8th floor office in Seattle and a staff of 6 people who called her Ms. Hartwell and who trusted the structure she'd given them. She had her own name, chosen from the middle pages of a novel, and she had her own chair, chosen from a showroom on Pine Street, and she had the specific, hard-won understanding of her own intelligence and capacity that could not be returned or revoked regardless of anything. She was not in danger of losing herself. The question was whether what she was considering was wisdom or repetition. Whether the thing she felt in this car was the same thing she'd felt at 19, standing at the edge of a room watching a man she had no business loving, or whether it was something different, something that had been tested by real information now, filtered through 3 years of accurate seeing, earned the hard way, and therefore trustworthy. She opened the folder one more time. She looked at the divorce decree. She looked at the asset transfer. She looked at Maddox, who was watching her with a stripped-down look and saying nothing, because he understood that this was not a moment that would be improved by words. She took the asset transfer from the folder. She held it for a moment. Then she tore it in half. He went very still. She tore it again and set the pieces on the folder's cover and said, "The 19 companies are already mine. Legally, completely, irrevocably. I don't need a document confirming what is already documented 6 ways in the public record." She looked at him. The asset transfer was leverage. I don't need the leverage anymore. The leverage was contingent on a situation that has resolved. He was looking at the torn document and then at her, and she could see him processing the specific meaning of what she'd just done. Not what she'd done with her hands, but what it signified, the particular statement it made about the architecture of what she'd built toward and what she'd decided she no longer needed from it. "The divorce decree," she said. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. The thing about decisions made in the light of accurate information was that they were clean in a way that decisions made in the dark never were. She had made the decision in the anteroom in the dark, or the decision had been made for her, which was the same thing at the time, with incomplete and distorted information about what she was and what she was worth and what the man she'd married was capable of seeing in her. She had spent 3 years acquiring accurate information. She set the divorce decree on the folder. She did not tear it. She closed the folder. "I'm not signing either document tonight," she said. "I'm not making a decision about this marriage in a car outside this estate after a warehouse and 2 gunshot wounds from 3 years ago and a day that has been—" She stopped. "I'm not deciding tonight. I need time and I need distance and I need to think about this without the adrenaline of the last 12 hours in my bloodstream." He let out a breath. She heard something in it. "That's not a no," she said. "It's not a yes either. I want to be accurate." "Okay," he said. "I'm going to my father's apartment," she said. "Tonight. I need to see him. I'll have someone drive you. I'll get a car," she said. "Your people don't need to be part of what happens next." She looked at him. "Neither do you. Not tonight." He looked at her for a moment. She watched him work through the impulse to push against this and reach the understanding that pushing was the wrong move, and had always been the wrong move, and that he was going to have to become a different kind of man if any of this was going to be worth anything. She watched him get there. "Okay," he said again. She got out of the car. "That's it." The cold came at her immediately, the lake wind with its particular indifference, and she stood beside the car for a moment and breathed and looked at the gate and the stone and the bare trees and thought about the woman who had walked through that gate 3 years ago with 11 pins in her hair and a decision she hadn't fully finished making. She took out her phone and called a car and stood on the road outside the Vescari estate while the car came, and when it arrived she got in and told the driver the address and leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for the first time since morning. She slept for 11 minutes in the back of the car. She knew it was 11 minutes because she checked the time when she woke, and the arithmetic was simple. It was the deepest 11 minutes of sleep she could remember, the specific, crashed-out sleep of a body that had been managing too much for too long and had found a brief moment when management was not required. She woke before they reached her father's street. She sat up and looked at the south side passing outside the window. The familiar geography of a neighborhood that was not glamorous and had never pretended to be. The kind of streets that were honest about what they were. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not resolution, but was in the same general territory. Her father's building was a 3-story walk-up that had been built in 1958 and had been updated only in the ways that were strictly necessary. She had the key still. She'd never given it back, never been asked for it. and she let herself in and climbed the stairs and knocked twice before using it. Eddie Cross opened the door before she finished knocking. He looked at her face. He looked at her hand, the scrape dried now, the shoulder she was holding slightly careful. He stepped back from the door and let her in and didn't say anything, because he understood that she'd come here for something that wasn't conversation, and he was, for all his failures, a man who understood what his daughter needed and when to provide it by being quiet. She sat in the kitchen. The hot pot mark was still on the table. The chair she always sat in had a small tear in the vinyl at the top right corner that had been there for 10 years. The refrigerator made its sound. He put the kettle on. They sat together while the kettle heated, and she looked at the hot pot mark and thought about the years this table had held, the meals and the homework, and the years after her mother was gone when it had just been the two of them eating across from each other with the specific, imperfect, inarticulate love of people who had nobody else. "I'm sorry," her father said. For the third time in their recent history, he seemed to have settled into saying it at regular intervals, which she understood was his way of living with himself. "I know," she said. "The man," he said carefully. "Maddox. Not tonight," she said. He looked at his hands. "Okay. I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up. "I'm not angry at you," she said. "I was. For a while I was very angry, and I didn't have the bandwidth to say so because I needed all of my energy for other things. But I want you to know that I'm not anymore." She looked at the hot pot mark. "What you did, the debt, the arrangement, it put me in a situation that was wrong and dangerous, and you knew it was wrong and dangerous, and you made the transaction anyway because you were afraid." She breathed. "But the situation is also what made me this. What I am now, what I can do now." She looked at him. "I'm not saying the trade was worth it. I'm saying it's complicated, and I'm not carrying the anger anymore because the anger stopped being useful, and I only carry things that are useful." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were red at the edges, the way they'd been at the wedding. "You're more than I deserve," he said. "I'm exactly what I built myself to be," she said. "You don't get credit for it, and neither does he. It's mine." She held his eyes. "But you're my father. That's also mine. I'm keeping it." He put his hand on the table between them, palm up. The gesture of a man with nothing to offer except the gesture. She put her hand over his. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen with the kettle and the hot pot mark and the refrigerator's sound, and she thought about all the rooms she'd been at the edge of her whole life, and the specific, accumulating weight of that. And she thought about the 8th floor office in Seattle, and the staff of 6, and the gray Volvo with the full tank. And she thought about the folder in her jacket, with the divorce decree still inside it, unsigned. She stayed at her father's apartment that night. She slept in her old room on a bed that was slightly too small, under blankets that smelled like the specific combination of fabric softener and old house that she associated more completely with safety than anywhere she'd been since. And she slept for 9 hours without interruption, which was the longest she'd slept in 3 years. In the morning, she sat at the kitchen table with her father's coffee, which was too strong the way it had always been, and she took the divorce decree out of the folder and read it from beginning to end with the thorough attention she applied to all documents of consequence. It was clean. Her lawyer had done good work. The terms were equitable, the language was precise, and the legal architecture of it would hold against any reasonable challenge. She set it on the table. She thought about what she'd said in the car, that she wasn't deciding tonight, that she needed time and distance. She had time. She had the rest of her life. The distance was the question. She had built distance for 3 years. She had been very good at it, had shaped it into something functional and load-bearing, had used it to support the weight of everything she'd constructed in its span. The distance was real, and it had served a real purpose, and she was not dismissing it. But she had also, last night in a car outside a stone gate, understood something she had been resisting understanding for the better part of a year. The distance was not the destination. It had been the method, and the method had been correct for the situation, and the situation had changed. Not because of anything he'd said, not because of the parking structure or the warehouse or the way he'd said her name in the dark 3 years ago. Those things had weight, and she had given them their weight honestly, without inflating or deflating any of it. because she had looked at the divorce decree and found that signing it required her to perform a certainty she did not actually have. She was a person who did not perform certainty she didn't have. She had learned that about herself in her 20s and had refined it into a principle over 3 years of building something real from accurate materials. You did not use false, load-bearing elements. They failed eventually and took everything built on them down. She did not know if Maddox Vescari was someone she could build something with. She did not know if the man who had sat across from her in a car and said the things he'd said was the accurate expression of who he was now or the performance of a man trying to recover something he'd lost. She did not know if the version of them that existed outside the context of cruelty and warehouses and 3 years of war could become something that was worth what it would cost. She genuinely did not know. And not knowing was not the same as no. She picked up her phone. She did not call Maddox. She called her lawyer in Vancouver, the one who didn't know who she was, and she told him to put the divorce decree in the inactive file. Not withdrawn. Inactive. Available but not in motion. She hung up. She sat with her father's coffee and looked at the hot pot mark on the table and felt the specific, uncomfortable, necessary feeling of a woman who has spent 3 years building a self strong enough to make a choice and is now making it without the protection of certainty, which is the only way any real choice is ever made. She flew back to Seattle 2 days later. Her office had been relocated temporarily while the 8th floor was assessed. The evacuation had been clean, no staff injuries, but the building's management had questions she'd had to answer through her lawyer in terms that were careful and complete. The temporary space was 4 floors lower with a partial view of the sound, and it smelled like someone else's work. And she sat in a chair that was not hers, and put the folder on the desk and opened her laptop and went back to work. She was good at work. She had always been good at it, and the last 3 years had made her better, had refined her understanding of what she was capable of and what systems she could build and what she could see that other people missed. She sat in the wrong chair in the temporary office and worked with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the work was not a substitute for anything. It was just the work. It was good, and it was hers, and it was enough on its own terms. Maddox called on the 4th day. She let it ring twice before she answered, not as performance, but because she was finishing a calculation, and she finished things she started. "I'm in Seattle," he said. "I know," she said. She had known since the previous afternoon, through a channel she didn't explain and he didn't ask about. "I'm not here to push," he said. "I'm here because I'm done conducting this by phone." She looked at the partial view of the sound. "There's a coffee place on 4th, she said. "It opens at 7. I'll be there at 7:15. A pause. "Okay," he said. She hung up and looked at the sound and thought about 7:15 and what she was going to say. She didn't know what she was going to say. She was going to go find out. The coffee place on 4th was the kind of place that Seattle did well. Small, serious about what it served, the kind of light in the morning that made everything look like the beginning of something. She arrived at 7:12 and got a table near the window because she had always chosen positions with clear sightlines, and she was not going to stop now. He came in at 7:15 exactly. He looked like a man who had slept badly and was not going to mention it, which she recognized as a form of dignity and noted accordingly. He got coffee and sat across from her and looked at her face with the stripped-down look. She had the folder. She set it on the table between them. "The asset transfer is gone," she said. "I told you why. The 19 companies are in the public record, and they're mine, and no document between us changes that." "I know," he said. "The repository filing is permanent," she said. "It's not leverage anymore. It's just a fact. The documentation exists in a federal system, and if anything happens to me or to my father or to anyone connected to me, it becomes accessible. That's permanent. That's not negotiable, and it's not personal. It's structural." "I understand," he said. "If you want to contest the acquisitions in court, you're entitled to try," she said. "You won't succeed, because the documentation of the legal process is thorough, but you're entitled to try." "I'm not going to contest them," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it because accuracy matters." He looked at her. "What are you doing?" "I'm establishing what's real," she said, "independently of what comes next, so that whatever comes next is built on accurate ground." He was quiet. "I'm not the woman from the anteroom anymore," she said. "I'm not going to come back and be the woman in the East Wing, watching and waiting and translating cruelty into something I can live with. That's gone. I'm not capable of it anymore, and I wouldn't do it if I were. I know, he said. If there is anything between us going forward, she said, it is between people who see each other accurately. It is between a man who understands specifically what he did wrong and why it was wrong, and a woman who has zero remaining capacity for being placed in a category and acted on. She looked at him steadily. That's the only terms on which this conversation has any future. He met her eyes. Those are my terms too, he said. I don't want the woman from the anteroom. I don't want anyone who requires managing or positioning or the performance of something she doesn't feel. He said this with the flat, certain tone of his most honest register. I want the woman who walked into my office with no evidence and no leverage and told me the truth about my uncle because she thought I should know it. I want the woman who built 19 companies in 3 years and tore the asset transfer in half because she didn't need it anymore. He looked at her hands on the folder. I want the woman who is sitting across from me right now and has not once, in this entire conversation, said anything she didn't mean. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the folder. She opened it and took out the divorce decree. She slid it across the table to him. He looked at it. That stays in your possession, she said. Not filed, not destroyed, yours. She held his gaze. If at any point the terms I described stop being the reality of what this is, I want you to have that in your hand ready to sign, not as punishment, as a record of what we agreed to and what happens when agreements aren't kept. He looked at the document. He picked it up with both hands and looked at it the way you looked at something that had real weight. Okay, he said. She breathed. The coffee place was filling up around them, the slow accumulation of a Seattle morning, people moving through the beginning of their days with the focused efficiency of a city that took its mornings seriously. She watched a woman at the counter order something complicated, and a man near the door read his phone with the expression of someone reading good news, and she thought about how unremarkable the moment looked from the outside and how completely unremarkable it was from where she was sitting. She had not won. That was the thing about outcomes that were true. They didn't have the clean shape of winning or losing. She had built something extraordinary from nothing, and she had survived things that should have broken her. And she had arrived at this table in this coffee place on a Tuesday morning in Seattle as a specific and complete person who had paid for every quality she possessed with something real, and none of that was the same as winning. But she was here. She was at the table, in her chair, in her own name, and the folder was closed, and the decree was in his hands, and the sound was visible through the window, and her coffee was getting cold, and all of it, the whole complicated, costly, unsentimental weight of it, was hers. She picked up her coffee. She drank it cold because it was what she had, and she had stopped waiting for things to be different from what they were. Outside, Seattle moved through its morning with the indifferent continuity of cities, and the sound was gray and flat and enormous, and the light was doing what winter light does when it finally decides to show up, arriving sideways, without ceremony, illuminating everything exactly as it was. She looked at Maddox across the table. He was looking back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. There was nothing that needed to be said that hadn't been said, and they were both, she understood, people who did not speak when they had nothing to add to the existing record. Then she set her coffee down and opened her laptop and said, I have a 9 o'clock. And he said, I know. I'll be here when you're done. And she looked at him once more. The stripped-down look returned, received, held. And then she looked at her screen, and she went back to work. The frightened girl who had once stood in a wedding dress in an anteroom and heard herself described as disposable was not entirely gone. She was in here somewhere, smaller now, quieter, filed in the same place as the 11 pins in the east wing chair and the hot pot mark on the kitchen table, the record of what it had cost to arrive at this. But she was no longer in charge. Vivian Hartwell was in charge, the woman who had built 19 companies and torn an asset transfer in half and walked into a warehouse with nothing but a folder and her own nerve, and had come out the other side with her father and her structure and her name intact. She was in charge, and she was at a table in a coffee place on 4th Street in Seattle on a Tuesday morning, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not managing the distance between what she appeared to be and what she actually was. They were the same. They had always been the same. She had simply needed to go far enough and work hard enough and survive enough to finally be in a room where that was visible. She typed the first line of her 9 o'clock preparation and felt the work settle around her like something familiar and trustworthy. And outside the window, the city moved through its morning, and the sound was gray and wide and going nowhere, and everything that had needed to be finished was finished, and everything that was beginning was beginning. And both of those things were true at the same time, which was the most honest description of a life that she had ever found.